There is a moment in the first season finale of Invincible where a father stands in a crater he made with his own hands, his son broken at his feet, his wife somewhere far above ground, and he asks the question that almost every other villain on this list is, in some way, an answer to. He asks what you will have after 500 years. That is the closest the show has ever come to a thesis statement on power. Every villain Mark Grayson has fought, every alien warlord, every dimensional drifter, every street-level lunatic, has been some version of an answer to that question. So tonight, exactly the way the title says, we are ranking every Invincible villain by power, from the very bottom to the absolute top, and we are taking our time about it. Get comfortable, turn the lights down low, and if you haven't subscribed to Rock yet, it genuinely does help us keep making these. We are starting at the bottom of the list, which means we are starting in a place that almost every Invincible fan finds gently embarrassing on a rewatch, because the bottom of an Invincible power ranking is not where forgettable villains go to be forgotten. It is where dangerous people go to be reminded that they were never the most dangerous person in the room. So at 35th on this list we have Multi-Paul, a man whose entire gimmick is duplication, and whose entire tragedy is that duplication is not enough. Multi-Paul shows up mostly in the comic, where he can produce copy after copy of himself, identical down to the clothes, capable of acting independently, capable in theory of overwhelming a single opponent with sheer numbers. In any other comic that would be a useful power. In Invincible, where the people he is most likely to throw himself at can lift trains over their heads or punch through concrete walls, a copy of Paul is still just Paul, and Paul is a man, and a man is one good swing away from a problem solved. There is something almost sad about him in the panels he appears in, the way every duplicate is a duplicate of the exact same fear in the exact same moment, multiplied out, all of them realizing at once that the trick is not going to work this time either. The show, as of the seasons that have actually aired, has not given him anything resembling a real arc, and even in the comic he is mostly a name in a wider rogues gallery rather than a standalone threat. He earns his spot at the bottom of this list not because his power is uninteresting on paper, but because the world he is in is built specifically to grind ordinary superpowers like his into background noise, and that, when you think about it for long enough, is part of what makes Invincible such a strange and quietly cruel superhero story. Most superhero universes are scaled so that an average metahuman can credibly threaten the planet. Invincible's universe is scaled so that an average metahuman can credibly threaten a small bank, and almost nothing else. One rung up, at 34th, we have Killcannon, who is, depending on which appearance you are looking at, a man who chose to have his arms replaced with literal artillery, or a man for whom that choice was made under duress. The show treats him largely as background color during the wider escalation of the world, a costumed criminal you might catch a brief glimpse of in a holding cell or a chase, and the comic, where he gets a little more room to breathe, presents him as a sort of walking arms manufacturer who is far less impressive once the arms have stopped firing. The thing about Killcannon, and this is part of why he sits where he sits on this list, is that the show universe has very obviously calibrated itself so that being a man with guns for arms is a profoundly mid-tier threat. He is a problem for the police, occasionally a problem for a sidekick, and roughly nothing at all to anyone wearing a cape with a Viltrumite stitched into it. He has, in the comic, gone toe-to-toe with the kinds of heroes who tend to fall outside of Mark's immediate orbit, and held his own for short bursts, and that is genuinely the high watermark of his career. He is the answer to the question, what is the most a normal man with weapons surgically attached to him can hope to accomplish in a world that also contains aliens with the power to fold continents in half? The answer is, not very much, but enough to merit a place on the list. The show, again to its credit, is quietly fascinated by the cheerful absurdity of this entire economy of low-level supervillainy. Killcannon is one of those characters whose presence in a frame is its own little argument that the line between street criminal and supervillain in this world is mostly a marketing decision. At 33rd, we have the Elephant, who is exactly what he sounds like, and who is also a useful reminder that one of the small pleasures of Robert Kirkman's writing is that he never resists a name that could just as easily have come from a child playing with their action figures. The Elephant has the strength of an elephant, the bulk of an elephant, and the absolute conviction of a man who has decided that being called the Elephant is a sustainable lifestyle choice. He is largely a comic character. In the live-action show he does not, as of the seasons that have aired, get any significant screen time, and the comic uses him more as a piece of texture than as a recurring villain. Strength-wise, he is genuinely a threat to someone like Mark in the very earliest stretch of his career, before Mark has fully understood what his own body is capable of. But as Mark scales, the elephant does not, and that is the curse of being a one-trick strength villain in a world that produces stronger characters at the speed Invincible's world produces them. He occupies that lonely middle ground between street-level threat and global threat, too strong to be policed by ordinary authorities, too weak to register against the people who could actually pose a real danger to the planet, and the show, when and if it ever gives him room, would almost certainly use him as a kind of comic relief moment, the way it tends to use the wider gallery of small-time costumed criminals. Sliding into 32nd, we find Magmaniac, the lava-based villain who is, depending on the issue, either a deep-cut comic reference, or the answer to the question of what would happen if a man decided to thematically commit to being made of heat. Magmaniac's powers are exactly what the name implies. He produces lava, he projects lava, he is in some appearances effectively made of lava, and his threat level depends entirely on whether the person he is throwing the lava at is the kind of person who is bothered by lava. Mark, after a certain point, is not. Neither is anyone in the upper echelon of meta-humans on the planet. He is, again, a comic character primarily, and his appearances tend to be brief and structural rather than narrative. He is there to be defeated in 2 or 3 panels so that the wider plot can move on. There is, however, something genuinely interesting about Magmaniac as a kind of thematic stand-in. He is one of a small handful of characters in the Invincible universe, who is essentially elemental, whose powers are not technological or alien, but tied to a kind of physical force. And there is a quiet argument running through the early issues of the comic that this kind of villain is, structurally, a relic of a previous era of superhero storytelling. Magmaniac is what superheroes used to fight, before Invincible decided that what superheroes actually fight is each other. At 31st, we find Universa, who is, almost uniquely on this lower stretch of the list, a villain whose name promises far more than her actual power level delivers. Universa has been described in different appearances as having cosmic abilities, energy manipulation, and a kind of broad reality awareness, and you would be forgiven for assuming that this puts her somewhere closer to the top of any sensible power ranking. The truth, as the comic has slowly revealed over the years, is that her version of cosmic power is, by Invincible's standards, fairly local. She is not on the level of the truly universe-threatening figures, she is not on the level of the Viltrumite hierarchy, and she sits, in practice, several rungs below characters like Battle Beast, who can functionally bench press her on a bad day. Her appearances are mostly brief, and her main contribution to the wider story is structural rather than personal, but she earns her position in the lower 30s on this list because her ceiling, when she is allowed to express her power, is genuinely interesting. She is the kind of character who in a different superhero universe would be a true major league threat, and who in Invincible's universe is more of a curiosity than anything else, which itself is a quiet little argument the show and the comic are making about scale. Moving up to 30th, we have Magnattack, the magnetism villain whose name is exactly the kind of pun the Invincible writers love, and the show occasionally trots out in throwaway lines. His whole thing is, predictably, magnetism, the manipulation of metal at a distance, the kind of thing that in another universe would put him in the top tier of meta-human threats. In Invincible's universe, where most of the truly dangerous people do not particularly care whether something is metal or not, magnetism is a useful but distinctly limited power set. He can pull the rifle out of a guard's hand. He can throw a car. He cannot, against the people on the upper half of this list, do anything meaningful with their bodies, because Viltrumites are not made of any one substance, and an alien like Battle Beast is not going to be slowed down by having a girder thrown at his back. Magnattack is the second clean example so far of a recurring Invincible joke, the way an entire generation of classical comic book villainy has been quietly downgraded by the fact that the most powerful people on the planet in this story are not vulnerable to the things that used to make those villains scary. The show, when it gestures at characters like him, tends to do it with a small wry smile, and it is hard to argue with that. At 29th, we have Doc Seismic, who is genuinely one of the early show's most underrated character moments, in part because the show plays his ridiculousness completely straight. Doc Seismic, in the live-action series, is the kind of villain who has an actual ecological mission statement and an actual catchphrase, and who reappears in Season 3 with a full reinvention, mounted on a contraption that allows him to project earthquakes across whole cities. The show, very gently, lets you laugh at him without ever cutting him down to a punchline, which is part of why the moment in Season 3 where Mark and Eve square off against him over a volcanic ridge actually carries weight. For a short stretch, he is a credible threat to ordinary humans, even as he is no real threat to either of the two people in costume in front of him. The arguable point here, by most fan readings, is that Doc Seismic is the show's clearest case study in the absurdity of what it means to be a costumed villain in a world that contains Viltrumites. He has the kind of grandiose plans that would, in the Silver Age of comic storytelling, have powered an entire annual issue. In Invincible's universe, he is roughly an afternoon's work for two people who are not even halfway up the power chart. The show, to its credit, lets you feel a tiny bit sad about that without ever saying it out loud. Slipping into 28th on the list, we have Isotope, who is one of the more genuinely interesting low-tier villains in the comic, and who has, as of the seasons that have aired, had only fleeting time on screen in the live-action show. Isotope's power is teleportation, the ability to shift himself and at times others, across short or long distances. And in a universe where the heroes are largely defined by raw strength and speed, that kind of dimensional flexibility is a deeply useful skill set. The reason Isotope is not higher on this list is that his teleportation is, by Invincible's standards, fairly local. He is not a multiverse hopper. He is not the kind of dimensional intruder we will be talking about much later in this list when we get to Angstrom Levy. He is, instead, a character whose tactical use is enormous, and whose direct power output, if you measure it the way Invincible measures power, is essentially zero. He cannot fight. He cannot survive a serious hit from any meta-human on the upper half of this list. He is, more than anything, a courier. The comic uses him at times as a way of explaining how characters end up in places they should not be able to reach, and the show, if it ever gives him room, will almost certainly use him for the same purpose. He is a power set in service of someone else's plan, more often than not, and that is itself an interesting and slightly melancholy use of a character. At 27th we have the Order, which is technically a villain group rather than a single villain, but the dynamics of that group are interesting enough that they belong in a list like this as a single-ranked entity. The Order is, in the comic, essentially a roster of mid-tier costumed criminals organized around a shared interest in being a problem for the heroes Mark tends to operate alongside, and they exist primarily to challenge a wider team rather than to challenge an individual. They are the kind of organization that exists to give a comic an issue's worth of fight choreography. Their power as a group is greater than the sum of their parts only in that they tend to ambush teams from multiple angles at once, which means a smaller team without coordination can be genuinely overwhelmed by them for a stretch, and a coordinated team can dispatch them inside the same issue. The show, as of the seasons that have aired, has not given the Order a sustained presence, and so most of what is true of them remains comic canon and is correctly understood as a piece of texture in the wider rogues gallery. They are useful here because they represent a class of villain that Invincible likes to indulge as a kind of throwback, the costumed group with the color-coded outfits and the synchronized entrance, and you can read the show's relationship to them as a low-key, affectionate critique of an older era of superhero comics. That reading is interpretation, not canon, but it lines up with the kind of choices the writers tend to make. 26th on the list belongs to M-Bane, the alien jail escapee whose appearance is one of those small moments early in the show that you might not remember by name, but who you almost certainly remember by silhouette. M-Bane is, in the comic, one of the prisoners who breaks out during a wider Mark Grayson-driven incident, and the show has played with his presence in passing as part of its early world-building around the cosmic prison and the wider non-human criminal population on Earth. Power-wise, he is genuinely formidable by a human standard. He has the kind of physical durability and strength that puts him meaningfully above ordinary opponents, and a fight between M-Bane and the average uniformed police force is not a fight at all. It is a cleanup operation in advance. The reason he is at 26th rather than higher is, again, the Invincible scaling problem. M-Bane is, by the standards of his home world, a serious criminal. By the standards of the planet he ends up on, where the people who patrol the streets in costume include a Viltrumite, a half-Viltrumite, a Martian, a robot, and a woman who can rewrite matter on a whim, he is a problem that gets solved before lunch. The show is again very subtly using characters like M-Bane to argue that the wider universe has not yet realized how dangerous Earth has become, and the comic is much more explicit about this point. Earth, in Invincible, is not a sleepy backwater the way it often is in superhero fiction. Earth is increasingly one of the most dangerous addresses in the known galaxy, and a steady drip of alien criminals like Bane keeps arriving and keeps finding out. At 25th on this list, we have Ka-Hor, the ancient possessing entity whose entire deal is that he is a kind of mummified consciousness capable of taking over a host body and using that host body to lash out at the world. Ka-Hor is, in the comic, a clever piece of writing because his actual power level depends entirely on the body he is currently inhabiting, which means his danger to Mark fluctuates wildly across his appearances. When he is occupying an ordinary human body, he is a problem on roughly the scale of a particularly determined and physically aggressive person. When he gets hold of someone with abilities, suddenly his ceiling jumps in ways that are interesting to think about. The version of him most fans remember, which is the version in the comic, sees him climb the threat ladder briefly before the heroes work out how to evict him. The show, as of the seasons that have aired, has not foregrounded him, and so the live-action version of Ka-Hor remains, at most, a piece of background texture. He is a useful presence on this list, because he is, structurally, one of the few villains in the entire rogues gallery whose power is not really his own. He is a parasite. He is a parasite with very specific limitations and very specific opportunities. And once you accept that, his ranking becomes a function less of personal power and more of available host. That is one of the more thematically rich choices the comic makes with him, because Invincible is, in some ways, a long argument about whose body you inherit and what you choose to do with the strength that comes pre-installed. 24th on this list belongs to Octobos, who is one of those invincible characters whose name does most of the work, and whose actual presence in the story is much smaller than the name suggests. Octobos, in the live-action show, is essentially a seafaring criminal with a kind of cybernetic suit and a small crew, and his appearances tend to be short, comedic, and structural. He is there to be dispatched by Mark or his peers within a single scene. The reason he is at 24th rather than further down is that the show has consistently been careful with how it presents him. He is portrayed as competent. He is portrayed as a credible threat to non-meta humans, which is to say, a normal human caught up in one of his schemes is in real and unpleasant danger. He is not, however, in any sense a credible threat to the kinds of people who are actually showing up to fight him, and the show plays that gap quietly for the gentle absurdity it contains. Octobos is, when you sit with the character long enough, one of the show's clearest case studies in what it actually means to be a small fish in a sea full of much bigger fish. He has, in his own self-image, a brand, a crew, a presence. The show, with deep affection, treats that brand and that crew and that presence as the texture of the world rather than the center of the world, and that is, more than anything else, what determines his place on this list. At 23rd we have Tether Tyrant, who is the kind of villain whose specific gimmick has a beautifully literal name. Tether Tyrant's power is tethering. He produces lines, cords, threads of energy that bind opponents to one another, or to surfaces, or to himself, and his combat style is built around denial of movement rather than direct damage. In a power ranking that scales primarily by raw strength and durability and speed, that is the kind of power set that struggles to climb very high, because the people on the upper half of this list can simply tear those tethers apart and walk through them as if they were paper. The reason he places at 23rd and not lower is that against the right opponent, he is genuinely an effective problem. A meta-human whose powers depend on movement, a hero whose speed is their main defensive measure, a target who needs to fly, can be effectively neutered by Tether Tyrant in a way that lets him punch above his weight class for short stretches. His appearances in the comic tend to underline this, and the show, when and if he ever surfaces, would almost certainly use him in similar ways. He is a denial character. He is at his most dangerous when paired with someone capable of capitalizing on the moment of stillness he creates, and at his least dangerous when forced to fight on his own. That, more than anything, is why he sits where he sits on this list. At 22nd we have Powerplex, also known in the comic as Scott Duvall, and for the first time on this list, we have a villain whose power level is genuinely a problem for Mark, and whose existence is genuinely a problem for the soul of the show. Powerplex's powers, in the comic, are based on absorbed kinetic energy. The harder he is hit, the more he can return, and that scaling mechanism is exactly the kind of trap that makes him a uniquely dangerous opponent for a brawler like Mark. The reason he matters, however, is not the powers. The reason he matters is his motivation. Powerplex is a man whose sister is killed in the comic during a fight between Mark and a Viltrumite, killed essentially as collateral damage, killed because the people swinging at one another above his city did not pay enough attention to where the falling debris landed, and he spends his entire arc trying to make Mark feel the specific weight of that loss. He is, in this sense, a kind of moral mirror held up to Invincible's wider universe, a question dressed up in a costume, and the question is whether the heroes are actually capable of fighting at their full power without grinding ordinary lives underneath. The show, as of the seasons that have aired, has begun to plant the seeds of this kind of consequence in other ways, and the live-action introduction of Powerplex in the third season carries that thematic weight forward. He is, power level-wise, somewhere in the middle of this list, but his thematic weight is much higher, and that reading, while interpretation rather than canon, is well supported by the actual events of his appearances. At 21st, we have Phaedrus the Philosopher King, whose presence on this list is, admittedly, a comic-specific one, but whose existence is too genuinely strange to leave out. Phaedrus is, in the comic, the leader of a population of Mars-adjacent beings who have decided to organize themselves around a very particular philosophical project, and his confrontations with the wider Invincible universe are short, strange, and surprisingly memorable. Power-wise, he is not a top-tier physical threat, but he commands a population. He commands a kind of intellectual gravity inside the comic's wider cosmology, and the threats he represents are the kind that resist direct physical solution. The show, as of the seasons that have aired, has not introduced him in any meaningful way, and the comic, when it brings him to bear, uses him to widen the universe into something more thoughtful and more strange than a simple punching match. There is, depending on the issue, something almost gentle about how Phaedrus is drawn into the wider plot. He is interpretation made flesh, the show's argument that not every villain Mark encounters needs to be a fist. Some of them are arguments, philosophies, organizations, and the response to them has to be something other than another punch. That is, again, interpretation, but it is interpretation the comic supports directly, and on this list it earns him a place comfortably in the lower middle, where his importance to the story exceeds his ability to take a hit. 20th on this list goes to the Lizard League, the collective name for the band of reptile-themed villains that includes King Lizard, Komodo Dragon, Supreme Lizard, and assorted other variations across the comic's long run. The Lizard League is, as a unit, one of Robert Kirkman's more openly affectionate parodies of the Silver Age supervillain team, the kind of organization whose members all share a theme and a costume color palette and a deep, deep commitment to their bit. Power-wise, the League is a genuinely competent threat as a group. They have brute strength, they have venom, they have armor, and they have, by the standards of street-level metahumans, a meaningful tactical coordination. Against an organized team of heroes, they can hold the line for a stretch, and against a single hero, who is not prepared for them, they can do real damage. The show, as of the seasons that have aired, has played with the Lizard League in passing rather than at length, and the comic is where they get their full run. They sit at 20th on this list because they represent something specific about how Invincible thinks about supervillain teams. The Lizard League is, structurally, a team of mid-tier threats whose only real chance at climbing the ladder is collective action, and the comic uses them again and again to argue that the rogues gallery of an Invincible-style universe is not really a ladder you can climb by yourself. It is a ladder where the only way for ordinary criminals to stay relevant is to band together against the kinds of forces that would, individually, defeat them in seconds. There is something genuinely sad about that, and the comic, every so often, lets you feel it. At 19th, we have the Mauler twins, who are, by a fairly comfortable margin, the most narratively useful mid-tier villains in the entire show. The Mauler twins, in both the comic and the live-action series, are a pair of identical, hyper-intelligent, hulking gray-skinned scientists who have a single ongoing argument about which one of them is the original and which one of them is the clone. And this argument has, across both adaptations, been one of Invincible's quietest running jokes. Power-wise, the Maulers are formidable but not top-tier. They are strong, they are durable, they are smart enough to engineer the kinds of devices and serums that change the course of larger plots. What actually elevates them, in the context of this list, is what they enable. The Maulers, in both the comic and the show, are the kind of villains whose direct power level matters less than the technologies they produce. They engineer robots' eventual body, they build serums, they produce the kinds of resources that lift other villains by several rungs, and that destabilize heroic plans in ways the heroes are not always able to see coming. By most fan readings, The Maulers are the universe's quiet argument for the danger of intelligence in a setting that tends to fetishize raw strength. They are not the strongest hands on the field. They are the strongest minds on the wrong side of it. And that is a kind of power that does not always show up in a straight punching contest. They sit at 19th because, in a direct confrontation, they will lose to a Viltrumite, or to a Sequid host, or to a fully evolved Angstrom Levy, but they will be 3 or 4 steps ahead of all of them on a longer timeline, and the show has, especially across its later seasons, been willing to let you sit with the implications of that. 18th on this list belongs to D.A. Sinclair, the genuinely terrifying engineer of the Reanimen. Sinclair, in his own person, is not a particularly impressive physical threat. He is a young man, by the standards the show establishes, almost embarrassingly slight, more comfortable in front of a workbench than in a fistfight, and on a list that ranks purely by direct power output, he would belong much lower. The reason he sits at 18th, rather than 30th, is that his power is not in his body. His power is in what he is willing to do to other people's bodies. Sinclair takes living human beings, often abducted students, often the kinds of people the wider world has already half forgotten, and he reduces them, surgically and chemically, to biomechanical soldiers that retain just enough of their original consciousness to know what is happening to them. The show, in the live-action series, lingers on this in a way that is genuinely difficult to watch on purpose, because the show wants you to understand that the violence in Invincible is not always loud. Sometimes it is a man with a clipboard and a soldering iron. Sinclair, in the show, ends up subject to the consequences of what he has done, in ways that are still, as of the seasons that have aired, playing out. The show has carefully set him up as one of Invincible's clearest case studies in the way intelligent, well-resourced cruelty can do at least as much harm as raw alien strength, and he earns his place on this list not because he can throw a punch, but because of how much harm he can put into the world without ever needing to throw one. At 17th, we have the Reanimen as a collective, separated out from their creator because, as a class of being, they represent something genuinely different from the man who designed them. The Reanimen are, in both the comic and the show, the cybernetic soldiers Sinclair produces from his abducted human subjects, and over the course of the show their threat level increases substantially. The early generations of Reanimen are roughly the equal of a single trained soldier with some heavy modifications, and they can be dispatched without enormous difficulty by characters like Mark or Cecil's existing GDA team. The later generations, which the show has progressively introduced across its seasons, are dramatically more capable. They incorporate combat experience, they incorporate captured meta-human abilities, they incorporate, in some of the most chilling moments the show has produced, recognizable remnants of the personalities of the people they used to be. The reason they sit at 17th rather than far lower is that, by the time the GDA is operating Reanimen as part of its regular field deployments, they are a meaningful component of how Earth tries to defend itself against alien incursions. They are, by most readings, the show's argument that the line between defensive technology and atrocity is much thinner than the people inside the GDA seem to want to admit. The show has not, as of the seasons that have aired, fully resolved this tension. It has, however, made clear that the Reanimen are no longer simply Sinclair's monsters. They are the monsters everyone now uses, and that is one of the more genuinely disturbing realizations the show is patient enough to lead you into. Sliding into 16th, we have Machine Head, who is, in both the show and the comic, the kind of mid-level criminal whose ambitions almost match his abilities, and whose abilities have always been quietly underestimated by the people who fight him. Machine Head is, on paper, a crime boss, the kind of figure who runs operations across a city, who owns property and people, who employs costumed lieutenants and ordinary thugs in roughly equal proportion. Power-wise, he has a number of cybernetic and intellectual enhancements that, in a direct physical confrontation with anyone in the upper third of this list, do him almost no good. The reason he is at 16th is that direct physical confrontation is, in his case, almost never the point. Machine Head is a network. He is a coordinated set of plans across multiple fronts. He is the kind of villain who has, in both the show and the comic, hired or coerced into service some of the more dangerous individual meta-humans on Earth, and his real power is measured by who he can convince to fight on his behalf. The show, as of the seasons that have aired, has used him primarily as a way of demonstrating that Earth has, beneath its parade of cosmic threats, an entirely separate ecosystem of mid-level meta-human crime that Mark cannot solve simply by being strong. Machine Head represents a class of problem that is deeply unflattering to the wider heroic project. He is what superheroes do not actually solve, because the people who answer to him are still there long after his particular reign ends. There is something quietly mature about that, and Machine Head's place on this list is, more than anything, a reflection of how the show takes the criminal underworld seriously, even when its alien sky is on fire. At 15th, we have Titan, the cybernetic enforcer who has the ability to transform his body into a kind of stone or rocky armor, dramatically increasing his strength and durability, and who, over the course of his arc, moves from being a clean villain to being a far more morally complicated figure inside the wider criminal underworld. The reason he matters on this list is that, at his physical peak, Titan can credibly hold his own in a fight against meta-human opposition that has very little business losing to a costumed man with stone armor. He has gone hand-to-hand with some surprisingly elevated competition in his appearances, and the show has, especially in its earlier seasons, used him to demonstrate exactly how negotiable the line between criminal and hero is in this universe. The reading that runs through Titan's arc, and that the show supports without spelling it out, is that the moral architecture of being a meta-human in Invincible's world is not built around clean categories. A man can become Titan because the only employer interested in his particular skill set is a crime boss, and once he is Titan, he can climb high enough that, with a particular combination of luck and timing, he becomes the crime boss himself. He sits at 15th on this list because, on the raw scale of who could beat whom in a straight fight, he is comfortably above the lower tier, and because, on the wider scale of how he reshapes the criminal underworld of Earth, he is a more important figure than his power level alone would suggest. At 14th, we have Dinosaurus, the genius scientist whose body has been transformed into a massive dinosaur-shaped form that combines enormous strength with a brain still capable of running geopolitical plans across global scales. Dinosaurus is, primarily, a comic character. The live-action show has, as of the seasons that have aired, not foregrounded him as a recurring villain in any way comparable to his comic role, although the show has done a lot of careful, quiet world-building that leaves room for him to surface at a later point. In the comic, Dinosaurus is a fundamentally different kind of villain from almost everyone we have talked about so far. He is not a costumed criminal. He is not an alien warlord. He is a man with a moral argument, a man who believes that the planet is on a fundamentally bad trajectory, and that the most pro-humanity thing he can do is to inflict enormous, calibrated, controversial suffering on parts of it, in order to redirect the whole. The comic, with patience and a degree of moral discomfort that is genuinely impressive, makes him sympathetic enough that you can find yourself, for stretches of his arc, almost agreeing with him. Power-wise, he is on the upper third of what a non-Viltrumite physical threat can be. He can take a serious beating from Mark and continue functioning. He can dispense punishment of his own that is genuinely dangerous. He is, however, not in the realm of the truly top-tier physical fighters, and his ranking here is less about the raw output of his power and more about the scale of the disasters he is willing to organize. He earns 14th because, of the non-Viltrumite enemies in the comic, he is one of the very small handful who has caused planet-scale loss of life on purpose, with a plan and a justification. 13th on this list belongs to Aquarius and the Atlantean royalty, treated as a combined entity for the purposes of this list, because the politics around them function as a kind of unified threat. Aquarius is, in the live-action show, the figure who interrupts Mark's life early on with what is essentially a marriage law dispute that escalates into a direct physical confrontation, and the absurdity of that escalation is, on a second viewing, one of the funniest pieces of writing the early show produces. The Atlanteans, however, are not a joke. They command an underwater nation, they have access to technology and combat capability that places them somewhere above ordinary human military forces, and somewhere just below the worst alien threats Earth tends to host. And a sustained war between Atlantis and surface Earth would, by most accounts, be a far worse problem for the wider heroic community than the comedic framing of Aquarius's first appearance might suggest. The reason they sit at 13th, rather than higher, is that the show has used them more as a piece of world building than as a sustained antagonist, and the comic similarly tends to treat them as a recurring strategic problem rather than an immediate physical threat. Their ceiling is high. Their floor is comfortably above the lower tier of meta-human criminals. They are, in the wider strategic picture of how Earth survives, one of the more dangerous nations on the planet, and that is the kind of power that earns its place comfortably above the merely individual. At 12th, we have the Flaxans, the small green-skinned dimensional invaders whose entire civilization has, in both the show and the comic, become organized around the project of attempting to conquer Earth, and whose enormous tactical problem is that time runs at fundamentally different rates between their dimension and ours. The Flaxans, in the live-action show, appear early as one of the show's first genuinely funny world-building reveals. Each time they invade, by the time Mark and the other heroes have repelled them, decades have passed in their own dimension, and the Flaxans return again and again with new generations and new technology, and each time they are the same problem, only differently shaped. The reason they sit at 12th is that, taken as a civilization, they represent a problem that cannot be permanently solved by punching. They are, structurally, the show's gentle argument that some threats are demographic rather than personal, the kind of thing you cannot defeat once and for all, because the people behind it will keep coming back as long as the underlying conditions exist. Power-wise, the individual Flaxan soldier is mid-tier at best, and a full Flaxan invasion force is, by the standards of the show, dispatched relatively quickly when there is a Viltrumite or a Mark Grayson on the field. As a recurring civilizational threat, however, they sit higher on this list than their individual combat ability would suggest, because the entire pattern of their incursions is a kind of slow drip on the planet, the kind of thing that wears down a wider planetary defense force over time, even when no single invasion is a serious problem on its own. At 11th we have Cecil Stedman, treated here as an antagonist rather than as a hero, and I want to be careful about how I frame this, because Cecil is not, in any clean sense, a villain. He is, however, repeatedly an obstacle to Mark, a withholder of information, a manipulator of his own assets, and across multiple stretches of the show, he is the figure Mark is forced to push against in order to act on his own conscience. So Cecil sits on this list as an adversary, in the sense that the show uses him to embody the entire institutional weight of the Global Defense Agency. Cecil himself, on the field, is a small man in a suit. He has, however, command authority over a workforce that includes metahumans, the entire Reanimen program, classified weapon caches, teleportation infrastructure, and, on more than one occasion in the live-action show, the ability to detain or remove from play the most powerful individual on the planet. The reason he sits at 11th on this list, and not lower, is that when Cecil decides Mark is the problem Cecil makes of Mark is genuinely shaped to defeat Mark, and the show has had the discipline to portray this realistically. He keeps secrets. He hoards leverage. He maintains a precise sense of how much each of his heroes is worth, and what each of his heroes will refuse to do. There is, in many readings of his behavior across the show, an argument that he is one of the most consequential figures in the entire wider narrative, because the bargains he makes around the use of state-level meta-human force essentially define the moral floor of the world Mark inherits. He is not, as a single body, a top-tier villain. He is, as the head of an organization, one of the most powerful single individuals on the planet, and the show has, especially in its third season, given that distinction the patient weight it deserves. The reason he ranks above several alien threats on this list is that, alone among them, he holds the keys to Earth's defense in his hands at all times, and he has, in more than one season, used those keys in ways that have made the heroes he employs deeply unhappy. At 10th we have the Sequids, the parasitic alien collective whose entire model of existence is built around finding hosts and binding to them as a kind of biosymbiotic command structure, and who, when they are in a position to do so, can transform a single host into a node of a much larger and much more dangerous hive. The Sequids in the show appear primarily across the Mars subplots, where their relationship with the Martians has, for centuries, been the defining political and survival problem of the Martian civilization, and Mark's accidental disturbance of that relationship triggers some of the most consequential off-Earth events of the wider show. The reason the Sequids sit at 10th, and not higher, is that their direct power depends entirely on the bodies they are bonded to. A Sequid alone is barely a threat. A Sequid attached to a Martian is a serious meta-human level threat. A Sequid attached to a Viltrumite, which the show has gestured at in fan speculation if not yet in confirmed canon, is potentially one of the worst-case scenarios anyone has ever imagined for the wider galactic order, because a bonded Viltrumite Sequid is theoretically capable of replicating the strength and durability of a Viltrumite with the coordinated tactical intelligence of an entire hive. The show, as of the seasons that have aired, has danced very carefully around this exact possibility, treating it as a recurring threat that the heroes are aware of and that the GDA is, by most readings, terrified of. The Sequids, taken as a civilization, are one of the very few entities on this list whose ceiling, in plain power terms, can rival the upper tier of Viltrumite threats, and the only reason they are not higher is that they have, as of the seasons that have aired, not actually realized that ceiling on screen. The argument the show is making with them, beneath the body horror and the off-Earth politics, is that intelligence and physical force, combined into a single entity that scales with whatever host is available, is one of the most dangerous shapes a power set can take in this universe. They earn 10th on this list because they are the kind of threat whose worst case is genuinely existential, and whose actual case so far has been merely catastrophic. At 9th we have Robot, also known as Rudy Connors, and his place on this list is genuinely complicated, in a way that I think is one of the most interesting things about how Invincible writes its rogues gallery. Rudy starts the show as a hero. He is a member of the rebuilt Guardians of the Globe. He is, in the early seasons, one of the more thoughtful and well-written members of that team, and the show takes great care to present his abilities and his condition with empathy. Robot is, in his original form, a remote-operated drone body controlled by a young man whose physical condition makes ordinary movement impossible. He is, by ability set, an intellectually elite figure with combat resources that include drones, weapons, and surveillance capabilities, and the most important resource he has, across the wider arc, is patience. The wider reading of Rudy, which the show has spent multiple seasons setting up, is that his slow drift from heroism towards something far more morally compromised is one of the show's central long-term arguments about how power, opportunity, and isolation interact. He builds, with the Mauler twins, the body he eventually inhabits, a body engineered to give him the physical experience of being a meta-human in a world where that experience is the closest thing anyone has to citizenship. From that point onward, depending on which medium you are looking at, Rudy makes a series of decisions that move him from ally to adversary, and the comic, in its later stretches, pushes him into a position of genuine power, in some readings the head of an entire global initiative, in some readings something even larger than that. The show has, as of the seasons that have aired, been careful to keep his exact destination open, but the seeds of where he is heading have been carefully planted, and his ranking here, at 9th, reflects the threat he represents at his comic peak more than the threat he represents at his current show position. He is on this list because the future of the show, as the comic suggests, hands him a great deal of strategic and physical power, and the early arguments for that future are already present in what has aired. That last point is interpretation, not canon, and the live-action version of Rudy may yet diverge meaningfully from the comic, but the trajectory the show has set him on is recognizable. 8th on this list belongs to Angstrom Levy, and Angstrom Levy is, depending on which version of the character you are looking at, either a tragic dimensional scientist who became a monster by accident, or one of the most personal and most patient threats Mark has ever faced. Angstrom, in both the show and the comic, has the ability to open portals to alternate dimensions, allowing him to step sideways across realities, and his original goal, before things went catastrophically wrong, was a fundamentally curious one. He wanted to find a version of Earth in which the problems of his own dimension had been solved, and to import those solutions back home. The show, in the second season, stages an event in which his attempt to combine his other dimensional selves into a single, complete Angstrom goes horrifyingly badly, leaving him scarred, mentally fractured, and convinced that Mark is the central reason for everything that has gone wrong with his life. The reason he sits at 8th on this list is that, while his personal physical ability is, on its own, modest by Viltrumite standards, what he is willing to do with his portals is essentially limited only by his imagination. He can drop Mark in a dimension where Mark is the villain. He can drop Mark in a dimension where his family is already dead. He can drop Mark in a dimension where the laws of physics work differently. The show, in its second and third seasons, leans into this with a kind of slow, building dread, and the comic, where the Angstrom arc goes much further, takes him to genuinely apocalyptic places, including a sequence widely regarded as one of the most disturbing things ever published in mainstream superhero comics, in which Angstrom inflicts a particular and very personal kind of harm on the people Mark loves. The show has, as of the seasons that have aired, not pursued the most extreme moments of the comic arc on screen, and that is the kind of restraint that an adaptation can rightly take, but the wider trajectory remains recognizably the same. Angstrom is on this list because, as a single individual, He is one of the very few villains capable of designing a specific defeat for Mark on a metaphysical level, and his ranking here, above the Sequids and above most of the wider Earth-based rogues, reflects exactly how cleverly the show has rendered the threat of a single sufficiently motivated and sufficiently informed dimensional engineer. At 7th, we have Battle Beast, the alien gladiator whose entire reason for being is the search for an opponent who can actually offer him a fight, and who is, in some fan readings of his comic appearances, capable of giving even a fully trained Viltrumite a serious problem. Battle Beast is, in his physical presentation, a towering, feline, armored warrior who arrives on Earth in the 2nd season of the show as part of a wider chain of events tied to Cecil's manipulations, and his arrival is the kind of moment the show seems deliberately staged to play like a release valve on accumulated tension. He fights the Guardians of the Globe more or less alone. He overwhelms them with embarrassing ease. He fights Mark hand-to-hand and very nearly kills him. The show, in the moment of that fight, is making a very specific argument about exactly where Mark sits in the wider hierarchy of the galaxy. Mark is the half-Viltrumite son of one of the strongest people the Empire has ever produced. Battle Beast walks through him and his peers as if they were children, and the only reason this is not the end of the show is that the team manages, with significant cost, to bring him down. Power-wise, Battle Beast is, on a single individual scale, in the very top tier of opponents in the comic. He has, in some panels, been written as superior in pure combat ability to certain Viltrumites of the era, and he has, in others, been brought low by them in ways that complicate the picture. The reason he sits at 7th on this list rather than higher is that, when compared to the truly top-tier Viltrumite threats and to the supreme leader of their empire, he sits, by most readings, slightly below the absolute peak. The comic, in particular, gives him a death scene that is, in its own way, one of the most quietly devastating sequences in the entire run, and the show, as of the seasons that have aired, has not yet reproduced that exact moment, but the trajectory is recognizable. Battle Beast is the show's clearest demonstration of the principle that the upper end of Invincible's power scale is genuinely terrifying, and that for a few minutes inside any episode he appears in, the entire wider story can feel as if it is one bad punch away from ending. At 6th, we have Lucan, the Viltrumite soldier who is, alongside Anissa, one of the 2 named Viltrumite agents the show has, across its seasons, brought into direct conflict with Mark and with the wider Earth defense. Lucan, in the live-action show, is portrayed as an experienced, calculating, surgically violent member of the Viltrumite military, and the show takes care to demonstrate that he is, by every available measure, simply better at being a Viltrumite than Mark is. He is faster, he is more practiced, he is willing to commit to lethal moves where Mark has been raised by Earth television to flinch at the wrong moment, and his appearances in the show amount to an extended argument about the gap between someone raised to inherit power and someone trained from birth to inflict it. Power-wise, Lucan is, by Viltrumite standards, in the middle to upper part of the standard soldier tier. He is not on the level of Conquest. He is not on the level of Nolan. He is, however, comfortably above almost every non-Viltrumite on this list, and the only reason he is not higher is that other Viltrumites, with more experience or more rank, sit above him. The show, in the seasons that have aired, has used him as the test case for what an ordinary Viltrumite soldier actually looks like in a fight, and that test case has been brutal. He has, in his on-screen appearances, taken Mark to the edge of what Mark can physically tolerate, and a sustained Lucan-led ground operation on Earth, without intervention from a comparably strong Viltrumite on the heroic side, would, by most accounts, be a planetary-level crisis. He sits at 6th on this list because, individually, he is a much more dangerous fighter than any non-Viltrumite on the planet, and because, collectively, the Viltrumite class he represents is the worst news Earth has ever received from off-world. At 5th on this list, we have Anissa, the female Viltrumite soldier, whose appearances in the show are some of the most psychologically uncomfortable scenes the live-action series has ever staged. Anissa is, by power level alone, comparable to or slightly above Lucan, and the show has been careful to demonstrate that she is, in pure physical terms, far above Mark's ceiling as of the seasons that have aired. She has, in their direct encounters, repeatedly beaten him to the edge of incapacitation without ever losing her composure, and the show has, in those scenes, used her composure as the most disturbing thing about her. She is not exactly angry with Mark. She is acting on a mission whose specifics are, from her perspective, a perfectly straightforward extension of Viltrumite reproductive imperative. The show has chosen to render this with a degree of moral seriousness that the wider streaming superhero landscape almost never bothers with, and the choice has been one of the bravest pieces of adaptation work the show has produced. The reason Anissa sits at 5th on this list and not higher is that, although her individual combat ability is exceptional, and her tactical patience is almost unmatched on the Viltrumite roster currently active, she is not on the absolute peak of the Viltrumite hierarchy. She is, by the Empire's own metrics, an excellent soldier, and there are figures above her that the show has either introduced or implied. The reading that has emerged across the seasons that have aired is that Anissa represents the Viltrumite Empire at its most coherent. She is, structurally, what a Viltrumite produced entirely inside the Empire's value system actually looks like, and her presence in any given fight is therefore one of the most thematically loaded moments the show is capable of producing. Mark cannot beat her in a straight fight. The show has gone out of its way to demonstrate this, and the moments where she chooses, for reasons of her own, to stop short of killing him are some of the most chilling beats the wider series has placed in front of you, because they make clear that she has, in every encounter, been operating at less than her ceiling. She earns 5th on this list because her capabilities are, by raw Viltrumite measure, in the upper echelon, and because the specific way she has been written to use those capabilities makes her the show's most uncomfortable mirror held up to the wider value system the Empire embodies. There is, in her scenes, almost no comedy. The show, which has consistently allowed itself to find absurd flashes of humor, even in its bleakest moments, has rendered her almost entirely without that release valve, and the result is that whenever she is on screen, the show feels, for stretches, like a much darker show than it is. That is a craft decision the writers have been remarkably consistent about. The argument the show is making with Anissa, beneath the brutality of her individual fights with Mark, is that the wider Viltrumite project is genuinely terrifying once you stop seeing it through the lens of Nolan's relationship with his family, and that the version of Viltrumite culture which produces officers like her is not interested in negotiation, not interested in compromise, and not interested in the kinds of moral complications Mark wants to apply to his own behavior. She sits where she sits on this list because, of the Viltrumites the show has currently put on screen, she is the one whose presence most completely communicates exactly what kind of empire Mark is up against. At 4th on this list we have Omni-Man, also known as Nolan Grayson, and there is a serious argument to be had about whether Omni-Man belongs higher on this list than 4th, because in many readings he is, on a purely physical level, comparable to or stronger than Anissa and possibly above Lucan, and his combat experience is, on the Viltrumite scale, very nearly unmatched. The reason he sits at 4th, rather than at the very top of this list, is that the comic, and by extension the show, have very explicitly positioned figures above him in the Viltrumite hierarchy, and his actual record across the show contains both moments of devastating supremacy and moments of significant defeat. Nolan, in the live-action show, is the villain the wider series is, in some readings, built around. The first season ends with his decision to abandon his mission of conquest in favor of saving his son, and the 2nd and 3rd seasons trace the long, painful, deeply human consequences of that decision for him, for Mark, for Debbie, and for an entire planet that has never quite recovered from the day it learned what its protector actually was. Power-wise, Nolan is, on the field, terrifying. He has killed an entire team of meta-humans, the original Guardians of the Globe, in a single ambush that is the show's defining act of violence and one of the most discussed scenes in any superhero television series of the last decade. He has fought Mark to a near-death conclusion at the end of Season 1. He has gone to war with off-world Viltrumite forces in later stretches of his arc, and the comic, where his arc reaches its full conclusion, takes him through an even longer series of moral and physical transformations. The reason he is at 4th on this list is twofold. First, in pure power terms, the wider Viltrumite hierarchy has both peers and superiors above him, and the show and comic have both made clear that he is not the Empire's ceiling. Second, in moral terms, Nolan's gradual movement away from the Empire and towards something resembling guilt has meaningfully changed how the show frames him. By the seasons that have aired, he is no longer cleanly a villain. He is something harder to categorize, a former antagonist whose remaining capacity for harm is enormous, but whose remaining willingness for harm is, by most readings, deeply complicated. He is on this list because, at his peak, he was the villain. At his current position in the show, He is a former villain whose continued existence is more dangerous than 1,000 more cleanly defined enemies, because his choices, depending on which way they fall, can still shape the entire trajectory of the wider universe. There is a melancholy on Nolan's arc that the show has handled with remarkable care, and the reason the wider rogues gallery of this show has any weight at all is because of what Nolan did at the end of the first episode, and the slow process by which the show has refused, across multiple seasons, to let either Mark or the audience easily forgive him for it. He sits at fourth because, on a power scale, that is where he belongs. He looms over every other entry on this list because, on a thematic scale, almost every other villain is, in some way, a piece of evidence for or against the question Nolan asked in the train tunnel at the end of the first season. At third, we have Conquest, the Viltrumite enforcer whose third season appearance is the single most physically extreme fight the live-action show has yet staged, and whose existence is the comic's clearest declaration of just how dangerous an active-duty top-tier Viltrumite actually is. Conquest, in the show, is dispatched to Earth after Nolan's defection and after the wider series of events that have made Mark a person of strategic interest to the Empire, and his arrival is the kind of plot beat the writers have deliberately positioned to redefine what the show is capable of putting on screen. He is older than Nolan, by Viltrumite measure considerably so. He has the experience of centuries of warfare. He has, in the comic, a track record of conquering entire worlds with minimal assistance and minimal mercy, and the show has been careful to render him as the kind of opponent against whom Mark, for the very first time in his career, is not really fighting to win. He is fighting to survive long enough for someone else to intervene. The fight at the end of the third season, which I am being careful to describe in general terms, rather than to spoiler with precise beats, is the show's most thoroughly committed argument about the futility of meeting a fully trained Viltrumite head-on. Mark is broken physically in ways the show has not been willing to depict before. Adam Eve enters the fight in a way that has consequences the wider show will be living with for seasons to come. Conquest, even in defeat, leaves the field with an enormous balance sheet of harm done. Power-wise, Conquest is, by every available measure, at or near the top of the active-duty Viltrumite hierarchy. He is, in the comic, often written as superior to Nolan in raw combat ability, and the show has, by the choices it makes around how their respective fights are staged, supported that reading. The reason he sits at third on this list, rather than at the very top, is that the comic has, in its later issues, introduced figures above him in the Viltrumite power scale, and the institutional weight of the Empire as a whole exceeds the individual weight of any single soldier, however highly trained. He is on this list because his appearance in the show marks the moment at which the wider series stopped being a coming-of-age story about a young hero learning his own capabilities and became a story about a young hero learning his own limits. There is, in the slow choreography of the Conquest fight, a kind of patience the show has never extended to any of its other villains. The camera, the sound design, the actual on-screen consequences, all of these are tuned to make clear that, on this day, Mark is fighting someone he should not be fighting, and the comic, where the Conquest arc has its full conclusion, only deepens that impression. He earns third on this list because, by most fan readings, he is the single most physically dangerous villain the live-action show has actually put in a ring with Mark, and because, in the wider Viltrumite hierarchy he represents, he is just below the absolute peak. At second on this list we have Thragg, the Grand Regent of the Viltrumite Empire, and Thragg is, almost without question, the most powerful single-named villain in Invincible's entire wider canon. I want to be careful here, because as of the seasons of the live-action show that have actually aired, Thragg has not yet been brought to the center of the on-screen narrative in the way he occupies the comic. The show has, by most readings, planted careful seeds about the wider Viltrumite leadership and about the existence of figures above the active-duty soldiers Mark has so far encountered. And the comic, where Thragg has his full run, gives those seeds a destination that is genuinely terrifying. Power-wise, Thragg is, on a flat physical scale, the strongest Viltrumite the comic ever depicts. He is, in the explicit hierarchy of the Viltrumite Empire, the supreme commander, the figure to whom every other Viltrumite owes allegiance, and the figure whose biological credentials are considered the purest expression of the Empire's value system. He has, in the comic, in single combat, defeated some of the strongest combatants the wider universe contains, and he has, in extended sequences, demonstrated a tactical patience that puts him meaningfully above almost every other named character in the entire run. He does not rage. He does not lash out. He acts with the calm authority of a man who has never had a serious reason to doubt his own supremacy, and that calm is part of what makes him, in the panels he occupies, so distinct from the more emotionally volatile Viltrumite figures we have already discussed. The reason Thragg does not occupy the very top of this list, despite being the strongest single individual in the wider Invincible canon, is that the list is structured around how much harm a villain can do to the wider world, and the answer to that question is that even Thragg's enormous personal power is exceeded by the institutional weight of the empire that has produced him. He is its sharpest point. The empire itself is the entire blade. The argument the comic makes with Thragg's arc, beneath the spectacle of his physical confrontations, is that the empire is bigger than even its strongest individual, and that no matter how much harm Thragg personally inflicts, the harm encoded in the wider Viltrumite project would survive his removal. The show has, as of the seasons that have aired, not yet placed Thragg in the wider narrative at the comic scale. It has, by most fan readings, made room for him, and the way the writers have framed the wider Viltrumite hierarchy across the 3rd and 4th seasons strongly suggests that the show is moving, slowly, towards a confrontation with the upper layers of the empire that Thragg embodies. That is interpretation, not canon, but it is the kind of interpretation the writers have been laying groundwork for since the very first season. There is, in the comic, a long, slow, deliberately escalating arc around Thragg that touches on questions of breeding, of empire, of generational responsibility, of the costs of leadership, and the comic is genuinely patient about what it asks the reader to sit with as it builds him out. He is not, in the comic, a single fight scene. He is a recurring problem that the wider story has to keep coming back to, and the resolution of that problem is one of the comic's most ambitious extended sequences. The show, when and if it brings him fully into its frame, will have to make some careful decisions about what it preserves and what it adapts, because parts of the Thragg comic arc rely on a specific kind of comic book scaling that the live-action show has, sometimes, chosen to render with more restraint. Power-wise, again, Thragg sits at the absolute peak of the named Viltrumite roster, and he is, by most fan readings, the figure most responsible for the Empire's current cultural shape. He is the answer to the question, what does it look like when an entire civilization organizes itself around a single individual whose physical supremacy is treated as a moral mandate? The answer, in the comic, is that it looks both stable and absolutely catastrophic, and that the people raised inside that arrangement are, by the very logic of the arrangement, almost incapable of imagining an alternative. He is on this list, near the top, because his individual capability is genuinely apex tier, and because the way the comic uses him to demonstrate the wider weakness of the entire Viltrumite project is one of the run's most morally interesting arguments. He is, by most fan readings, the show's eventual final boss, if the show chooses to follow the comic to its endpoint, and the seasons that have aired have been quietly working towards giving him the build-up such a confrontation would require. There is, in the show's choices around how it presents Anissa, around how it presents Conquest, around how it has been willing to gesture at the wider hierarchy without revealing its peak, a kind of patience that the writers do not extend to other corners of the story. They are holding Thragg in reserve, and the reason they are holding him in reserve is that, once he steps fully on screen, the wider stakes of the show change permanently. It is one of the strongest arguments the show can possibly make about its own ambition that it has not yet stopped saving him for the right moment, because the moment, when it arrives, will be the kind of moment around which an entire final season can plausibly be organized. He sits at second on this list, just below the Empire itself, because no matter how powerful he is in any single confrontation, he is not the entire problem. He is the apex of a much bigger problem, and the bigger problem is, by most readings, the actual center of what Invincible's wider story has been about since the train tunnel at the end of the very first season. At first on this list, in the position of the most powerful villain Invincible has ever produced, we have the Viltrum Empire itself, treated as a single-ranked entity rather than as the collection of named soldiers we have already discussed across this list. I want to be clear about why this is structured the way it is, because there is, in principle, a reasonable argument for putting Thragg in the first position by virtue of being the Empire's most powerful single body, or for putting Nolan in the first position by virtue of being the show's emotional center of antagonism. The reason this list places the Empire at the top is that the comic and the show have both been arguing, patiently and across many years, that the actual villain of Invincible is not any one Viltrumite. The actual villain is the value system that produced them, the centuries of accumulated militarism that gave them their training, the breeding programs that have shaped what they are biologically permitted to be, the cultural rituals that decide who lives and who dies among their own children, and the wider strategic ambition that has reduced entire civilizations across the galaxy to vassal status. That is the actual antagonist the show has been building up to since the train tunnel scene at the end of Season 1. The Viltrum Empire is, in the comic and increasingly in the show, presented as a galactic-scale political project that operates on a single ruthless logic, which is that the strongest should rule the weakest, that the strongest are biologically determined, and that the Viltrumites are, by definition, the strongest. Everything else, every law, every diplomatic protocol, every military operation, every officer like Anissa and Lucan in Conquest, flows from that single foundational claim. The comic, with a degree of moral seriousness that genuinely surprises new readers, takes this claim seriously enough to interrogate it, and most of the wider arc of the comic's later issues is an extended argument about whether the Empire can be reformed from within, dismantled from without, or whether it has to be allowed to collapse under its own internal contradictions. There is no easy answer offered. The reason this matters for a list like this is that the Empire's scale of harm exceeds the scale of any single Viltrumite. Even Thragg, even Conquest, even Nolan at his absolute physical peak, are individual expressions of a much larger problem, and the larger problem is the Empire itself. The Empire has, across the wider canon, conquered worlds. It has destroyed civilizations. It has, in the comic, killed enormous fractions of its own people in eugenic culling programs designed to maintain the purity of its bloodline. It has made a deliberate culture out of brutality, on a scale that no individual within it could plausibly produce on their own, and the show has, in the seasons that have aired, gestured very carefully at exactly how deep that wider history goes. The argument the show is making, beneath the spectacle of its individual fights, is that the project of being a Viltrumite is itself the project that has to be reformed, and that no individual Viltrumite, no matter how sympathetic, can be allowed to escape implication in what the wider Empire has done. Nolan, in the show, is asked to face this directly, and his arc across the wider series is a slow process of being forced to recognize that he is not just a man who did some bad things on Earth. He is a man who served, for centuries, an institution whose entire model of being is genocidal. That is a heavy reading to lay on a streaming superhero series, and the show, to its credit, does not soften the implication. It lets the silence in the train tunnel at the end of Season 1 sit. It lets the moment land, and then it spends seasons playing out the consequences of that silence, in ways that make clear that the Empire, not Nolan, is the actual center of the story. The reason this list places the Empire above Thragg, and above every individual Viltrumite, is that reading. The Empire's harm is collective, intergenerational, structural. It cannot be defeated by a single fight, however well staged. It cannot be reformed by a single individual, however well intentioned. It is the kind of villain that Invincible has been engineered to talk about, the kind of villain that ordinary superhero storytelling tends to flinch away from, and the kind of villain that, by the end of the comic, requires almost the entire wider universe to address. There is a quietly devastating sequence in the comic in which the wider scale of Viltrumite expansion is mapped, and the map is one of the more sobering pieces of art the comic ever produces. It is not a list of battles. It is a list of civilizations that no longer exist, in part or in whole, because the Viltrumite Empire decided they should not. The show, as of the seasons that have aired, has not yet produced that map on screen, but it has planted the pieces required for the map to eventually surface. The Viltrumite Empire is the only villain in the wider Invincible canon whose harm is genuinely existential to the wider galaxy, and the only villain whose defeat, in the comic and possibly in the show, requires a coordinated alliance among civilizations that have, for centuries, been too afraid of each other and too afraid of the Viltrumites to organize. The argument the comic makes is that the Empire's fall, when it eventually comes, has to come from inside as much as from outside, and that the inside of the Empire, the children raised in its values, are the people most equipped to dismantle it if they ever decide to. Nolan is one such child, Mark is another. The wider drama of the show, across the seasons that have aired, is a slow, careful exploration of what those two specific individuals owe to each other and to the wider galaxy in light of what the Empire that produced them is doing to other worlds. The reason the Empire sits at the very top of this list, the reason every other villain we have discussed across this script is ranked beneath it, is that no other villain on the list has the same scale of harm encoded in their existence. The Empire is not a person. The Empire is a project. The project is the project of refusing to acknowledge that the strong owe anything to the weak, of refusing to acknowledge that biology is not the same thing as virtue, of refusing to acknowledge that being capable of doing harm is not the same thing as being entitled to do it. Invincible is, beneath everything else, the story of a young man who has been raised inside a value system that says these refusals are obvious, who has begun, slowly, to question them, and who is going to have to spend the rest of his life either accepting those refusals or fighting them. The Empire is the villain because the Empire is the value system. Mark's arc is the slow, painful realization that the value system is the actual problem, and the wider rogues gallery we have discussed across this list is, by most readings, the Empire's pieces, the Empire's downstream effects, the Empire's downstream rivals, and the Empire's eventual replacement candidates. There is no single fight that ends the Empire. There is no single death that ends it. There is, instead, a long process of attrition, of allied resistance, of internal reform, and of the slow recognition by the Empire's own children that the value system they were raised inside is, in fact, the thing that has to die. The comic, in its later issues, takes some genuinely surprising swings at this conclusion, and the show has been positioning itself to take similar swings in the seasons that remain. The Empire is at the top of this list because the Empire is, by most readings, what Invincible is actually about. Every other villain has been a piece of evidence. The Empire is the case. A list like this one, ranking every villain in Invincible by power, can never really be complete, because the wider canon contains so many figures who, for one reason or another, sit uncomfortably at the edges of the definition of villain in the first place. So before we begin the wider closing thoughts of the night, it feels worth spending a stretch of time on the people whose names have come up in fan conversations again and again, but who, on this particular list, have not quite earned a numbered position. These are not exactly honorable mentions in the way the phrase is usually used. They are, more accurately, the figures whose presence in the wider story is just slightly to the side of the question this list is trying to answer. They earn discussion, even if they do not earn a numbered place, and the night is long enough that we can afford to sit with them for a while. The Immortal is the clearest of these. He is, across most of the show, on the side of the heroes, a long-lived figure whose tenure stretches back centuries, and whose role across the rebuilt Guardians of the Globe is, for several seasons, that of a senior, slightly out-of-step ally, rather than an antagonist. There are stretches of the show, however, where his alignment becomes genuinely complicated, where his grief for fallen colleagues and his sense of failure as a leader push him into actions that can be read as a kind of soft villainy. He is, in the comic, eventually pulled into far more morally compromised places than the show has yet allowed, and the wider arc of his character is the kind of thing the show has been keeping in reserve for later seasons. He is not on the numbered list because he is not, on any honest reading, currently a villain, but his presence in any discussion of who has, at one moment or another, opposed Mark or the wider hero community is worth acknowledging. Power-wise, he is, by the show's standards, in the upper middle tier. Old enough to have learned more than almost any other character how to fight, strong enough to be a meaningful field presence, not, in any direct comparison, on the level of an active-duty Viltrumite, but on the level of a hero who can credibly hold a line against threats that would shatter a less experienced fighter. Damien Darkblood, the demonic investigator, is another figure who appears around the edge of the villain conversation without ever quite settling there. He is, in the show, an outside agent with his own moral logic, his own methods, his own willingness to operate around the protocols of the GDA. His investigation into Nolan's killing of the Guardians is one of the most clear-eyed moments the early show produces about exactly what kind of person Nolan is, and the way Cecil maneuvers Damien off the playing field is one of the moments that sets up the wider antagonism between Cecil and Mark that will play out across later seasons. Damien is not exactly a villain. He is, however, an antagonist of a kind, a figure whose interests do not perfectly align with the hero's interests, and his presence in the wider universe represents a class of supernatural actor whose role the show has, as of the seasons that have aired, only barely begun to explore. He is mentioned here because, if the show ever decides to lean into the supernatural strand of its world, Damien is the most plausible doorway into that strand. Kursk and the wider roster of Russian super soldiers are another set of figures who recur in the comic and who have been gestured at in the show's wider world building. They are not, on any clean reading, Mark-specific opponents, but they exist as a reminder that meta-human geopolitics in the Invincible universe is not limited to the United States and to the Viltrumite Empire. There are state-level meta-human programs around the world, some of which the comic has explored in detail, and the show, as of the seasons that have aired, has only gestured at. They are mentioned here because the existence of those programs is one of the show's quieter and more interesting arguments about what global power actually looks like in a world where the strongest individuals on Earth can fly across continents in a single afternoon. The alternate marks of the multiverse are another category that resists clean placement on a power ranking. Angstrom Levy's portal abilities, as we have already discussed, give the show and the comic access to versions of Mark Grayson who have made different choices in their own dimensions, and some of those choices have produced, in the comic in particular, versions of Mark who are genuinely terrifying. The arc commonly referred to by readers as the Invincible War, which the show has not, as of the seasons that have aired, brought fully to the screen, features versions of Mark from alternate dimensions arriving on the main Earth with very different intentions, and the resulting set pieces are some of the most visually overwhelming sequences in the entire comic. They are mentioned here because, if you take a strictly literal reading of the question of who counts as an invincible villain, an alternate dimension Mark who has gone bad is, by any reasonable accounting, one of them. The reason none of those marks are on the numbered list above is that they are, structurally, projections of Mark himself, and treating them as separate villains rather than as expressions of Mark's own potential would mean changing the meaning of the wider list. They are, however, the kind of figure whose presence in the wider story is interesting precisely because they make the question of who Mark could become an explicit, visible, on-screen problem. There are also a number of comic-specific villains whose role in the show, as of the seasons that have aired, has been either reduced or skipped entirely, and who deserve a brief acknowledgement here for completeness. The Lizard League's individual members, separated from their group, have, in the comic, surfaced occasionally as solo threats. Magnattack's appearances have, in the comic, given him a slightly more developed personality than the show has yet seen fit to give him. The various individual members of the Order have, in particular comic issues, demonstrated levels of capability that, on a strictly individual ranking, would place them slightly higher than the group's collective ranking on this list. None of these distinctions, however, fundamentally change the wider shape of the ranking. They are, more than anything, evidence that Invincible's comic, in particular, has produced a wider gallery of named meta-human criminals than any single live-action season can plausibly bring to the screen, and that the show's decisions about who to elevate and who to keep in reserve are decisions made primarily for pacing rather than for fidelity. There are also the figures whose alignment has shifted over the course of the wider story. Robot, as we have already discussed at length, begins as a hero and drifts toward antagonism. Titan moves from villain to ally again, depending on which arc you are reading. Eve, the most prominent moral figure on the hero side, has, in some readings, made decisions that are ethically uncomfortable in ways that are easier to recognize on rewatch. The wider show is deeply uninterested in clean categorization of its characters, and the result is that any list of invincible villains, however carefully constructed, inevitably has to make decisions about exactly when a given figure stopped being a hero, or stopped being a villain, or stopped being either. The ranking above has tried to make those decisions in a way that respects the center of each character's arc, but reasonable readings differ, and a different ordering could be made with equal honesty. The Sentinels of America-style alternate heroes, who appear in the comic as a kind of corporate-sponsored response to the Guardians of the Globe, are another piece of the wider gallery that earns a brief acknowledgement. They are not, in any clean sense, villains, but they represent a particular kind of institutional antagonism that has, in the wider show, been gestured at in passing. They are the kind of organization that exists, on the comic side, to give the wider universe a piece of texture about exactly how varied the meta-human community really is, and they earn a mention here because the live-action show has been quietly setting up similar institutional rivals for later seasons. The wider question of who counts as a villain in Invincible is one of the show's more genuinely interesting ongoing arguments. The comic is famous for the gradual drift of multiple characters across the line, and for the willingness of the writers to let some characters never quite settle on either side. The show has, in the seasons that have aired, demonstrated a similar willingness, and the result is that a list like this one is, in some real sense, a snapshot of a moving picture. The characters at the bottom of the list could move up. The characters at the top could find themselves displaced by new arrivals. The figures around the edge could either rise into clear villainy or settle back into ally roles. The wider story is deliberately structured so that this kind of motion is always possible, and that is part of what makes a list like this one feel, in the best possible way, provisional rather than final. There is one more class of figure worth discussing before we move into the closing thoughts of the night, and that is the figure of the unbuilt or as yet unintroduced villain. The show has, as of the seasons that have aired, been very careful about how many of the comic's later villains it has actually placed on screen, and there are several names that fans of the comic will recognize, but that viewers of the show have not yet seen. The full Thragg arc is, by most fan readings, the most significant of these. The wider Viltrumite leadership hierarchy is another. The specific consequences of certain comic arcs that the show has deliberately chosen to defer or to adapt with restraint also belong here. None of these figures are on the numbered list because they are not currently active in the show in the way the numbered list requires, but they are mentioned here because the wider trajectory of the show points toward their eventual arrival, and the seasons that have aired have been planting the kinds of seeds that, if grown to full size, would extend this list considerably. It is worth, at this point in the night, sitting with the wider question of what a power ranking of invincible villains actually means, because the show has, across the seasons that have aired, been making a quietly subversive argument about the entire concept of measuring villains against each other. Most superhero universes treat the power level of their villains as a kind of currency. Each villain has a number, the heroes get to fight slightly more dangerous versions of those numbers as the story progresses, and the wider arc of a superhero story is built around the steady upward climb of the number. Invincible is both deeply familiar with this convention and deeply suspicious of it. The show, especially as it has developed across its later seasons, is increasingly interested in the question of what raw power actually buys you in moral terms, and the answer the show keeps returning to is almost nothing at all. The most powerful villains on this list, by raw physical measure, are the Viltrumites, and the wider arc of the show is structured around the demonstration that the Viltrumites' physical power has produced a civilization built on a fundamental moral error. The least powerful villains on this list, by raw physical measure, are the low-tier street-level metahumans whose existence is mostly absurd, and the show has consistently used them to demonstrate that ordinary people in this universe have a kind of dignity that the Empire's stronger members have, by the Empire's own choices, made themselves incapable of recognizing. The wider implication of this structure is that the ranking on this list is not, in any meaningful sense, a moral ranking. It is a ranking by capacity for harm, and capacity for harm is not the same thing as importance to the wider story. Multipol, at the bottom of this list, may, in some quietly devastating sense, be more interesting as a person than Conquest is, because Multipol's failures are recognizable as human failures, and Conquest's successes are not. There is a deliberate flattening on the part of the show, a refusal to allow the audience to treat the most powerful villains as automatically the most interesting ones, and the writers have been remarkably patient about reminding the audience of this across the seasons. The other wider question worth sitting with, at this point in the night, is the question of who actually counts as a villain in a show like Invincible. The traditional superhero genre has, for most of its history, treated the villain as a single, definable, externally visible figure who exists to be opposed by the hero. Invincible has, across its seasons, been increasingly willing to broaden that definition. Cecil is, on the hero's nominal side, but he is, by repeated demonstration, an obstacle to Mark's moral progress, and, on more than one occasion, a participant in the kind of strategic harm that, in a less sympathetic frame, would mark him as a clear antagonist. Robots' drift across the line is not a single moment, but a series of decisions taken across multiple seasons. Eve's choices about how she uses her enormous matter manipulation abilities are, in some readings, choices that, if made by another character, the show might mark as villainous. Even Mark himself, in particular sequences, makes decisions that are difficult to defend on any clean ethical reading, and the show has been increasingly willing to sit with that discomfort rather than to explain it away. The result is that a list like this one is, in some real sense, a list of the externally visible villains, and the wider villainy of the show is more diffuse than any single ranked figure can capture. There are choices made by heroes in this universe that have produced more wider harm than several entries on this list, and the show, when it slows down enough to acknowledge those choices, treats them with the seriousness they deserve. This raises a question that the wider Rogues Gallery is designed to make you ask, which is what exactly the show thinks superhero stories are for. The conventional answer, across most of the genre's history, has been that superhero stories are for the dramatization of straightforward moral conflict. Heroes are good, villains are bad. The conflict between them is structured so that the audience can identify with the heroes, and the wider universe is built around the assumption that this identification is uncomplicated. Invincible has never been satisfied with that answer. The show has, across its seasons, been increasingly interested in the kinds of moral conflicts that resist clean identification, the kinds of situations in which the audience is asked to sympathize with someone who is, by any standard external measure, doing something genuinely harmful. Nolan is the clearest example of this, but the wider Rogues Gallery is full of similar invitations. Angstrom Levy, at certain points in his arc, is genuinely sympathetic, and the show is comfortable letting the audience feel that sympathy even while the wider plot insists on his role as an antagonist. Powerplex, in the comic, has a motivation that is, on first principles, easier to defend than several of Mark's own actions during the same period, and the comic is comfortable letting the reader sit with that complication. The wider show is organized around the assumption that an audience can hold this kind of moral complexity without flinching, and the result is a Rogues Gallery that, on close inspection, is filled with figures whose role as villains is more provisional than the surface of the show might suggest. There is, beneath all of this, a question that the entire show is asking about what it actually means to be powerful. The Viltrumites are powerful by accident of biology. Mark is powerful by accident of inheritance. Eve is powerful by accident of childhood medical experimentation that the comic treats with far more weight than the show has so far chosen to dwell on. Cecil is powerful by accident of institutional position. The Maulers are powerful by accident of intellectual capacity and the willingness to follow their conclusions wherever they lead. None of these characters earned their power in any moral sense, and the wider show is increasingly clear about the implications of that. Power in Invincible is something that happens to you. What you choose to do with it is what defines you, and the wider Rogues Gallery is structured around the demonstration of all the different ways a character can fail at that choice. Multipol fails by being weak in spirit. Killcannon fails by being unimaginative. The Maulers fail by being too proud to recognize the harm they enable. Sinclair fails by being curious in directions that no ethical scientist should follow. Machine Head fails by being a kind of small ambition multiplied by a kind of large opportunity. Angstrom Levy fails by being unable to forgive a man for an injury that, in the original moment, was not entirely about him. The Viltrumites fail collectively by being unable to imagine that anyone outside their own genetic lineage is worth the consideration they extend to one another. The wider show is a kind of long argument that these failures are not separate. They are instances of the same failure, the failure to use your power in service of anyone other than yourself, and the wider gallery of villains is the gallery of all the different ways that failure can be dressed up to look like something else. There is a further argument running through the wider show about the relationship between violence and meaning. Invincible is, by any reasonable measure, one of the most violent mainstream superhero properties of the last decade, and the show has been willing to depict consequences of fights that other shows would, for reasons of audience comfort, gloss over. The Guardians of the Globe scene at the end of the first episode is the show's declaration of its commitment to this approach, and the seasons that have followed have, again and again, returned to the principle that violence in this universe is not weightless. There are, however, two different kinds of violence in the show, and the wider Rogues Gallery is structured around the distinction between them. The first kind of violence is the violence the heroes perform against the villains. This is the kind the show treats as, on balance, justified, although it has, especially in its later seasons, been increasingly willing to interrogate even this. The second kind is the violence the villains perform against ordinary people. This is the kind the show treats as the thing that needs to be opposed, and the wider Rogues Gallery is organized around the demonstration of all the different ways ordinary people can be harmed by characters whose powers far exceed those of the people around them. Multipol's harm to ordinary people is small. The Viltrumite Empire's harm to ordinary people is enormous. The wider list, ranked from bottom to top, is a ranking of how much ordinary harm each villain is capable of causing, and the show is deeply interested in the moral implications of that ranking. The show is also increasingly interested in the question of what defense against this kind of harm actually looks like. Cecil's argument, across multiple seasons, is that defense requires institutional structure, requires the willingness to make compromises with figures who would, in a cleaner moral universe, be unambiguously villains. Mark's argument, across multiple seasons, is that defense has to be founded on a refusal to make those compromises, even when the refusal carries enormous cost. The show is not entirely on either side of this argument, and the wider drama of the seasons that have aired is the slow process of letting both sides play out against each other until something resembling synthesis is forced. The wider villains on this list, in their various positions, are the test cases for this argument. Sinclair is the kind of villain Cecil's institutional approach cannot entirely justify. The Viltrumites are the kind of villain Mark's refusal of compromise cannot entirely defeat. The show is asking the audience to sit with both of these implications, and the wider rogues gallery is structured around the demonstration that no single moral approach is sufficient. There is a further structural question worth sitting with, which is the question of what kinds of villains a superhero story can and cannot include. The conventional superhero genre has, for most of its history, restricted itself to certain kinds of villains: the street-level criminal, the mad scientist, the alien invader, the world conqueror, the dimensional intruder. Invincible has, across its seasons, included examples of all of these, but it has also included examples of villains who sit slightly outside the conventional gallery. The institutional villain in the form of the GDA, the systemic villain in the form of the Viltrumite Empire, the personal villain in the form of Angstrom Levy, the interior villain in the form of Mark's own emerging moral compromises. The wider show is deliberately expanding the definition of what a superhero villain can be, and the result is a rogues gallery that, on close inspection, is more conceptually varied than the surface of the show might suggest. There are entries on this list whose existence would be difficult to imagine in a more conventional superhero universe, and the show's willingness to include them is one of the things that distinguishes it from its closer genre neighbors. This is, by most readings, the deeper reason why the Empire sits at the top of this list. The Empire is not, in any conventional sense, a villain. It is an institution, a system, a value architecture. The show has, across its seasons, made the argument that a system can be a villain, that a value architecture can be a villain, and that the failure to recognize these as villains is, in itself, a kind of complicity. The Viltrumite Empire is the show's clearest case study in this argument, and the wider rogues gallery is the set of all the different individual villains who are, in various ways, instances of the wider system. There are individual Viltrumite soldiers on this list. There are individual humans empowered by Viltrumite ambition on this list. There are individual aliens whose civilizations have been altered, often catastrophically, by Viltrumite interference. The wider implication is that the Empire is the actual center of the rogues gallery, and that the gallery as a whole is, in some real sense, the Empire's downstream effects. The structural sophistication of this design is one of the things that makes Invincible such a strange and quietly demanding superhero story to engage with. Most superhero stories ask the audience to follow a single antagonism through to a single resolution. Invincible asks the audience to follow a much wider antagonism, the antagonism between a value system and the people who have been shaped by it, through a series of partial and provisional resolutions across many seasons. And the wider rogues gallery is the show's way of demonstrating that no single resolution can possibly be sufficient. The bottom of the list does not, in any meaningful sense, get solved by the hero's actions against the top of the list. The top of the list does not, in any meaningful sense, get solved by the hero's actions against the bottom. The wider problem of the show is the problem of the value system itself, and the only kind of resolution that can address that problem is a slow, generational, internally driven transformation of the value system from within. The comic, in its later issues, takes some genuinely surprising swings at this kind of resolution, and the show, as of the seasons that have aired, has been quietly positioning itself to attempt similar swings in the seasons that remain. There is, beneath everything, a final thematic argument running through the wider show that this list cannot quite capture, which is the argument about inheritance. Invincible is, beneath everything else, a story about what a son inherits from his father, and the wider rogues gallery is the gallery of all the different ways that inheritance can go wrong. Nolan inherited the Viltrumite Empire's value system, and his struggle with that inheritance has produced both his most monstrous acts and his most redemptive ones. Mark inherited Nolan's inheritance at one further remove, and his struggle with what to do about that inheritance is the wider center of the show. Powerplex, in the comic, is a kind of dark mirror of this theme, a man whose grief about an inheritance not his own has produced a different kind of monstrous response. Anissa, Lucan, and Conquest are the Empire's chosen inheritors, the figures who have, by training and by selection, been shaped to carry the Empire's value system forward into the next generation. The wider show is asking the audience to sit with the question of what an inheritance like this actually obligates the inheritor to do, and the wider Rogues Gallery is the set of all the different answers various characters have given to that question. There is no clean answer offered. The show is comfortable with that, and the result is a Rogues Gallery whose deeper meaning, on second viewing, is far more thoughtful than the surface of the show might initially suggest. There is, beyond the question of who the villains are, the further question of how each season of the live-action show has organized its Rogues Gallery, because the seasons that have aired have taken meaningfully different approaches to which villains they center and which villains they treat as background. The first season is built around a single concealed antagonist, Nolan, whose villainy is, for most of the season's runtime, hidden in plain sight. The wider Rogues Gallery of the first season, the Mauler twins, Titan, Machine Head, the various costumed criminals Mark encounters in his earliest career, are all positioned as distractions from the central revelation. They are real threats. They occupy meaningful screen time. They do real damage. But the show is careful to make clear that none of them, individually or collectively, are the actual story. The actual story is Nolan, and the first season's closing sequence is the show's declaration that the wider villains of a show like this are not necessarily the ones in costumes. The wider villains can be the people closest to you, the people whose stated mission was to protect you, the people whose entire public identity was built around the assumption that they were on your side. This is one of the most subversive structural choices a mainstream superhero show has made in the last decade, and it has shaped the Rogues Gallery of every subsequent season in ways that the live-action audience has, by most readings, mostly accepted without remarking on. The second season is structurally different. Where the first season is built around concealment, the second is built around expansion. The wider Rogues Gallery of the second season opens significantly, with the introduction or major elevation of Sinclair, the Reanimen, the Sequids, the Mars subplot, Angstrom Levy, and a more developed sense of the wider Viltrumite empire. The season is the show's clearest demonstration of the principle that the universe Invincible inhabits is genuinely large, and that the wider Rogues Gallery is not limited to Earth. The second season also begins the long process of complicating Cecil's position relative to the heroes, and the resulting tension is one of the season's most quietly important threads. The Rogues Gallery of the second season is the show's argument that the problems of a superhero universe at this scale are not problems that can be solved by punching, and that the wider gallery has to expand to include figures whose threat is institutional, dimensional, biological, and ideological. The second season is where the show begins to look most like the comic in its full ambition. The third season is where the show makes its largest structural commitments to the wider Viltrumite arc, the introduction of Anissa as a major recurring threat, the eventual arrival of Conquest, the deepening of the Mars and Sequid material, the expansion of Mark's wider strategic problem from a planetary defense one to a galactic one. The third season is the show's most direct argument that the wider antagonism of Invincible is the Viltrumite Empire, and the season that has aired since has continued to develop that argument with patience. The wider Rogues Gallery of the third season is smaller in headcount than the second, but larger in scale. Each individual villain has more weight. Each fight has more lasting consequence. The wider arc is the season in which the show stops being a coming-of-age story for Mark and becomes something significantly larger, something that more closely resembles the wider scope of the comic in its mid to late issues. The fourth season, as of the writing of this script, has aired in full, and the show has made specific choices about how to continue this trajectory. I am being careful, in this stretch, not to spoil specific beats from the fourth season for viewers who may be encountering the show on a delayed schedule, and I am being careful in particular not to claim details about the season that I cannot confirm from the perspective of what has actually aired. The wider direction the show has taken is one that continues to elevate the Viltrumite antagonism, continues to develop the Sequid threat, continues to complicate the institutional position of the GDA, and continues to expand the gallery of named antagonists in ways that are positioning the wider story for the kind of resolution the comic eventually offers. There is a clear sense across the seasons that have aired that the show is moving towards a larger confrontation with the wider value system of the Viltrumite Empire, and that the Rogues Gallery of the remaining seasons is likely to be organized around figures whose role in that confrontation is significant. There is, Alongside the wider question of how the seasons are organized, the further question of how Invincible compares to the other dark superhero properties of its broader era. The show shares a streaming era with The Boys, with Watchmen adaptations, with various other attempts to engage with the moral complications of superhero storytelling in ways that the previous generations of the genre rarely did. The comparison that fans return to most often is with The Boys, because both shows engage with the question of what happens when superhuman power is in the wrong hands. The differences, however, are more important than the surface similarities. The Boys is, by most readings, a satire, a story whose central energy comes from the disjunction between the public image of superheroes and their private behavior, and whose villains are structured around a kind of corporate critique. Invincible is not a satire, it is a tragedy, in the older meaning of the word, a story about people who have been given enormous capabilities by accident, and who are mostly trying to work out what those capabilities oblige them to do. The villains of Invincible, even the most clearly drawn ones, are not hypocrites in the way The Boys' villains are hypocrites. They are people who have been raised inside value systems that make their behavior seem natural to them, and the wider show is more interested in understanding those value systems than in mocking them. This is part of why the Rogues Gallery of Invincible has the particular shape it does. The villains are people whose moral architecture can be reconstructed from the inside, and the show is deeply interested in doing that reconstruction even when the wider plot is asking the heroes to oppose them. The further structural distinction worth dwelling on is the relationship between Invincible and its source comic, because the live-action show has been neither a strict adaptation nor a fully independent reimagining. The seasons that have aired have made specific choices about what to keep, what to alter, what to delay, and what to merge from the comic's wider plot. The wider Rogues Gallery has been one of the show's most carefully managed adaptation problems. Some characters have been brought to the screen with their comic roles roughly intact. Others have been altered in ways that reflect the show's wider commitment to slightly more moral seriousness about consequences than the comic's pacing always allowed. Others have been delayed, either because their comic introduction comes later in the wider story than the seasons that have aired have reached, or because the show has made specific decisions about when to deploy them for maximum effect. The wider result is a Rogues Gallery that, on close inspection, has its own internal logic, neither identical to the comics, nor entirely separate from it, and the audience experience of watching the show is partly the experience of watching a careful translation process play out across many seasons. The role of the family, both as a heroic engine and as a villainous one, is one of the show's most distinctive contributions to the wider genre. Most superhero stories treat the family as either a source of motivation or a source of vulnerability. The hero has a family, the family is threatened, the hero acts to protect the family. Invincible is far more interested in the family as the actual site of the wider drama. Mark's family is not just his motivation. His family is the wider source of his moral education, his physical inheritance, his cultural commitments, and his eventual obligations. The wider Rogues Gallery is structured around the demonstration that the family can be the site of moral failure as easily as the site of moral success. Nolan, as Mark's father, is both the most influential moral teacher of Mark's life and the most catastrophic moral example. Debbie, as Mark's mother, is the figure who carries the weight of recovering from Nolan's failure across multiple seasons, and the show has treated her arc with a degree of seriousness that the wider streaming superhero landscape rarely affords to the mothers of its protagonists. The wider show is deeply interested in the question of what a family owes to itself when one of its members has done something monstrous, and the wider Rogues Gallery is organized partly around the demonstration of various failed answers to that question. There is a particularly subtle argument running through the wider show about the relationship between love and harm. Most superhero stories treat love as a stabilizing force, a thing that grounds the hero, a thing that motivates the hero to make good choices. Invincible is more honest about the ways love can also be a destabilizing force, a thing that pulls the hero towards compromise, a thing that gives the villains their most effective leverage. Nolan loves Debbie, and his love complicates his ability to commit fully to the Viltrumite project. Mark loves his family, and his love complicates his ability to make the clean strategic choices that the wider war against the Empire would require. Eve, in some readings, makes a series of choices across the seasons that have aired that are the product of a love that the show is unwilling to either fully endorse or fully condemn. The wider Rogues Gallery has its own relationship with love. Angstrom Levy's loss of love for the alternate dimensional families he has visited is part of what makes him so dangerous. Powerplex's loss of love for his sister is the entire engine of his arc. The show is comfortable with the suggestion that love is not a guarantee of moral correctness, and that the most monstrous things a character can do are sometimes done in the name of love itself. There is, alongside all of this, the further question of how the show handles the figure of the bystander. The traditional superhero story has, for most of its history, treated bystanders as a kind of background, a set of figures whose presence in the frame is mostly decorative, whose deaths are, when they happen, treated as motivation for the hero rather than as events with their own meaning. Invincible is far more interested in the bystander as a moral problem in their own right. The Guardians of the Globe scene, at the end of the first episode, is the show's declaration of this interest. But the seasons that have followed have continued to develop the theme. Ordinary people in the Invincible universe are not decorative. They are the people whose lives are being shaped by the decisions of the meta-humans around them, and the show has been increasingly willing to dwell on the specific weight of the harm done to them. Powerplex in the comic is the clearest version of this argument made into a villain. The wider Rogues Gallery, however, is partly organized around the demonstration that bystanders matter to the wider show, and that the hero's moral worth is measured by how seriously they take the cost of their fights to the people who are not in costume. There is one further distinct feature of Invincible that deserves a long meditation, which is the way the show handles its animation as a moral instrument. Animation, in the wider history of superhero storytelling, has often been treated as a child-friendly medium, a place where superhero stories could be told without the kinds of consequences that live action might demand. Invincible has, from its first episode, used animation in exactly the opposite way. The show is deliberately using animation to depict consequences that live action would have to either refuse or substantially soften, and the result is a show whose visual language is much more committed to the weight of violence than the surface of the medium might initially suggest. The wider Rogues Gallery is partly defined by this commitment. The fights look like fights. The damage looks like damage. The aftermath looks like aftermath. The show has made an extended argument that animation is exactly the right medium for the kind of moral seriousness Invincible is trying to bring to the genre, and the wider Rogues Gallery is partly a beneficiary of that argument. A villain like Conquest, in animation, can be drawn at exactly the scale and weight the comic demands, and the resulting fight scenes can carry the visual weight that live action would have to either modify or compromise. The show's animation is one of its quietest and most consequential moral choices, and the wider Rogues Gallery is more compelling because of it. There is, beneath all of this, the further question of the show's voice cast, because the live-action show, while animated, has been built around a particular set of voice performances whose contributions to the wider Rogues Gallery are central. Steven Yeun's performance as Mark is the show's anchor, and the wider gallery of villains has been organized partly around the dynamic each new performer creates with him. The performers who have voiced the various Viltrumites, the various human metahumans, the various aliens, have all brought specific tonal contributions that the wider show has used to define the Rogues Gallery's overall feel. I want to be careful, in this section, not to make claims about specific performance choices that I cannot back up, but it is a defensible point that the voice cast of the show has been part of why the Rogues Gallery feels as varied as it does. The performers who have given voice to characters like Anissa, like Conquest, like Sinclair, like the Maulers, have given the wider Rogues Gallery a kind of vocal texture that the comic, by its nature, could only suggest. The wider experience of the show is partly the experience of the Rogues Gallery as a series of voices, and the writers have taken full advantage of that. There is a particular pleasure, when you have sat for this long with a ranking of every villain in a show like Invincible, in returning to the bottom of the list and looking back up. Multi-Paul, who occupies the very bottom of this list, is a character whose place in the wider universe is, in some real sense, comically minor. He is, by every available metric, the smallest fish on the list. But the bottom of the list is not the bottom of the universe. The bottom of the universe is occupied by ordinary people, by the bystanders we have already talked about, by the citizens of a planet whose superhuman ecosystem is accelerating away from them in ways that the wider show has been increasingly honest about. From the perspective of an ordinary person on Earth in the Invincible universe, Multi-Paul is terrifying. He can clone himself. He can outnumber a small police response. He can do real harm to ordinary lives. The wider show is comfortable with the fact that the bottom of its Rogues Gallery is, from a certain perspective, still meaningfully above the people the heroes are nominally protecting, and the show has been increasingly willing to dwell on the implications of that gap. The wider question is what the heroes owe to the people whose vulnerability they have, in some real sense, helped to construct by occupying the same world. The wider rogues gallery is one of the show's ways of asking this question. Each villain is a different scale of harm, and the wider list is a kind of audit of the various ways meta-humanity makes ordinary humanity more vulnerable. There is a further argument about the relationship between the rogues gallery and the wider geography of the show. Most superhero stories restrict their action to a specific city, a specific country, or, at the largest scale, a specific planet. Invincible has deliberately resisted this restriction. The wider rogues gallery includes villains whose theater of operations is Earth's surface, Earth's underwater civilizations, Earth's adjacent dimensions, the asteroid belt, Mars, the deeper galaxy, and the wider Viltrumite Empire's many vassal worlds. The show has been patient about expanding this geography across its seasons, and the wider effect is that the rogues gallery is organized across a much wider canvas than most superhero stories attempt. This has consequences for how the wider list above has to be read. A villain whose theater of operations is a single American city, however dangerous, is not on the same scale as a villain whose theater of operations is multiple star systems, however much of a fight either could put up in a single encounter. The wider list has tried to weigh both kinds of consideration, and the result is a ranking that, on close inspection, is not quite a ranking of pure fightability, and not quite a ranking of pure strategic scale, but a kind of synthesis between the two. There is a question that fans of the show have returned to again and again about whether the rogues gallery of Invincible is actually more morally interesting than the rogues galleries of its closer genre neighbors, and the question is worth sitting with at length because the answer is not obvious. The wider streaming era has produced several superhero shows whose moral seriousness is comparable to Invincible's, and several whose moral approach is significantly different. The wider question is whether Invincible's specific combination of pulp comic book scale with serious adult consequences is a coherent moral project or merely a stylistic preference. The seasons that have aired have increasingly suggested that it is the former. The wider show is comfortable letting the visual extremity of its violence carry the weight of an argument that more restrained shows have to make through dialogue, and the wider rogues gallery is more effective for that choice. A villain like Conquest can be drawn as a genuinely terrifying physical presence in a way that a live-action show might have to either tone down or render with significantly more compromise, and the wider show's willingness to commit to the visual scale of its villains is one of its quieter and more consequential moral commitments. The wider rogues gallery is also organized around a particular kind of escalation that fans of the comic recognize as a deliberate design choice. The earliest villains' Mark fights are ordinary in their ambitions. The later villains are planetary in their ambitions. The latest villains are galactic. The wider effect is that the show has used the rogues gallery as a kind of scale that the audience can use to track Mark's own growth as a hero. Each new tier of villain represents a new test of what Mark is capable of, and the wider show has been patient about pacing this scale so that the audience can absorb each new tier before the next one arrives. The wider list is therefore not just a ranking of villains by power. It is a record of the wider show's pacing decisions, and the seasons that have aired have been remarkably disciplined about that pacing. There is a further argument worth sitting with about the relationship between Invincible and the wider tradition of comics, whose protagonist is a teenager. The teenage superhero is, in the wider history of comics, almost always a stand-in for the experience of growing up in a world that is larger and more dangerous than the protagonist initially realized. Spider-Man is the obvious comparison, and Robert Kirkman has, in various interviews, been open about the influence Spider-Man's structural template had on the wider Invincible project. The crucial difference, however, is in how the rogues gallery is used. Spider-Man's rogues gallery is mostly a gallery of figures whose presence in the protagonist's life is finite. Each villain is a contained challenge whose defeat closes a chapter. Invincible's rogues gallery is far more permanent. The Viltrumite Empire does not end with the defeat of any single Viltrumite. The Sequid threat does not end with the defeat of any single Sequid host. The wider show is more interested in the rogues gallery as a continuing problem than as a sequence of resolved encounters. And the wider effect is that the wider list has to be read as a snapshot of a continuing situation rather than as a final accounting of resolved enemies. This has interesting implications for how the wider show treats the question of victory. Most superhero stories are structured around the assumption that victory is possible, that each fight ends with a clear outcome, and that the protagonist's wider arc is the slow accumulation of victories that, by their end, are supposed to mean something. Invincible is deeply suspicious of this assumption. The seasons that have aired have been increasingly willing to depict fights whose outcomes are ambiguous, fights whose costs are disproportionate to their benefits, fights whose long-term consequences are mostly negative even when the immediate result looks like a win. The wider Rogues Gallery is organized partly around this suspicion. Each villain is less a problem to be solved than a problem to be managed, and the wider show is increasingly clear about the moral weight of that distinction. The wider list is therefore not exactly a list of defeated enemies. It is a list of ongoing problems, some of them temporarily contained, some of them actively expanding, and the wider trajectory of the show is the slow accumulation of those problems into something that, by the end of the comic, and possibly by the end of the show, becomes a genuine planetary scale crisis. There is one final structural feature of the wider Rogues Gallery worth dwelling on, which is the way it interacts with the show's larger thematic preoccupation with parenthood. We have already talked about inheritance. The wider question of parenthood, however, is slightly different. Inheritance is about what gets passed down. Parenthood is about what gets chosen by the people doing the passing. Mark, by the seasons that have aired, has begun the slow process of becoming a parent figure in his own right, both in his family and in his wider relationships with younger meta-humans. The wider Rogues Gallery is structured partly around the demonstration of various models of parenthood, all of which fail. Nolan as a parent is a failure. The Viltrumite Empire's collective parenthood of its own children is a failure on a planetary scale. Even the Maulers, in their strange way, are parents to a kind of intellectual lineage that they themselves cannot fully control. The wider show is asking the audience to sit with the question of what good parenthood actually looks like in a world where parents have the power to shape entire civilizations, and the wider Rogues Gallery is the gallery of all the different ways that question can be answered badly. The wider implication is that Invincible is, beneath everything else, a show about the slow process by which a young person learns to take responsibility for the inheritance they did not choose. The wider Rogues Gallery is the field on which that lesson is being taught. Each villain is a piece of evidence about what happens when the lesson is refused. The Viltrumite Empire is the largest example of a refused lesson. The smaller villains are smaller versions of the same refusal. The wider show is suggesting that the wider problem of the universe is the wider failure of inheritance to produce responsibility, and that the wider task of Mark Grayson, across the seasons that have aired and the seasons that remain, is to demonstrate that this failure is not inevitable. There is one final perspective worth offering on the wider list, which is the perspective of someone reading it for the first time, perhaps as their introduction to the show, or perhaps as a way of catching up on a series they have been hearing about for years. The wider list is a kind of map. It is a representation of the wider Invincible universe that, by virtue of being a ranking, has a particular shape. The shape is a triangle. The bottom of the triangle is wide, populated with small-time costumed criminals whose threat to the wider planet is mostly negligible. The middle of the triangle is narrower, populated with figures whose threat to the wider planet is real but contained. The top of the triangle is narrowest of all, populated by figures whose threat to the wider planet is existential. The wider effect of looking at the triangle is to understand that the wider universe of Invincible is deeply unequally distributed in terms of who can do what to whom. The wider show is deeply interested in the consequences of this inequality, and the wider list is one way of making the inequality visible. There is a kind of comfort in seeing the inequality laid out, because the wider show, in motion, can sometimes make it feel as if every villain Mark fights is on roughly the same scale of threat. The list makes clear that this is not the case, and that the wider drama of the show is partly about the question of which scale of threat the wider community of heroes is actually equipped to handle. There is a further question worth sitting with about what the wider list does to the audience's relationship with each individual villain. A villain at 35th on this list is easier to laugh at than a villain at 2nd. A villain at 2nd is harder to laugh at than a villain at 35th. The wider effect of reading the list is to recalibrate the audience's emotional relationship with each villain, and the wider show is comfortable with this recalibration. There is a kind of permission the show extends to the audience to find some of the lower-tier villains funny, even when they are doing harmful things, because their harm is contained at a scale that the wider planetary defense apparatus can manage. There is no such permission extended for the upper-tier villains. The wider show is careful to make clear that the figures at the top of the list are not occasions for humor, they are occasions for fear, and the wider Rogues Gallery is structured around the demonstration of where exactly that line gets drawn. There is a stretch of any long Invincible rewatch in which the entire show seems to be quietly making the same argument again and again, in different shapes and at different scales, and the argument is that no one in this universe has ever been ready for the power they have. The wider Rogues Gallery is the strongest single piece of evidence for this argument. Nolan was not ready for the power that being a Viltrumite gave him, and his unreadiness produced both the Guardians of the Globe scene and the entire wider trajectory of the show's first season. Mark is not ready for the power that being a half Viltrumite gives him, and his unreadiness has produced, across the seasons that have aired, both the show's most heroic moments and the show's most morally complicated ones. The Maulers are not ready for the intellectual power they have, and their unreadiness has produced an entire underground economy of dangerous technologies that the wider planet is only barely keeping up with. Sinclair was not ready for the technical power he discovered, and his unreadiness has produced the Reanimen, who are now too useful for the wider planetary defense apparatus to abandon, even though no honest person involved in operating them can pretend they are not atrocities. Cecil is not ready for the institutional power he holds, and his unreadiness has produced, across multiple seasons, a series of choices whose consequences he has increasingly struggled to defend. The wider show is almost obsessive about this argument, and the wider Rogues Gallery is the gallery of all the different ways unreadiness can curdle into harm. The show is also making a quieter argument about the relationship between unreadiness and forgiveness. Each villain on the wider list above is a candidate for either condemnation or forgiveness, and the wider show has been remarkably careful not to make these judgments on the audience's behalf. The audience is asked to sit with each villain and to weigh, on their own terms, whether the villain's behavior can be explained, contextualized, partially excused, or wholly condemned. The wider effect is that the Rogues Gallery is a kind of moral exercise. The audience is not being told what to feel about each villain. The audience is being asked to develop a sustained moral relationship with each villain, and the wider show is trusting that the audience is capable of this exercise. This is one of the things that makes Invincible feel different from its closer genre neighbors. Most superhero shows do not trust their audiences to do this work. Invincible does. The wider Rogues Gallery is more rewarding to sit with on second and third viewings because of that trust. There is a particular kind of viewer for whom the Rogues Gallery becomes the show. The wider Invincible audience contains viewers whose interest is in Mark, viewers whose interest is in the family, viewers whose interest is in the action, and a smaller but devoted set of viewers whose interest is specifically in the Rogues Gallery as an object in itself. The latter group watch the show partly in order to track how each new season expands the wider catalog of villains, how the show makes choices about which comic villains to elevate, which to delay, and which to merge into single roles. The wider list above is partly a document for that group, a record of where the catalog stands as of the seasons that have aired, and a kind of forecast about where it might be heading. The wider experience of the show is partly the experience of watching a catalog grow, and the Rogues Gallery is the show's most generous gift to that kind of viewer. There is a kind of stillness that settles in around any really long meditation on a fictional Rogues Gallery, because the wider question of who fights whom inside a show like Invincible is ultimately a question about what the audience is willing to imagine. The wider villains on this list are not exactly real. They are the imagined consequences of certain choices made by writers, artists, animators, voice performers, and showrunners, and they exist only as long as those people continue to imagine them. The wider show is an ongoing collaboration between the people who make it and the people who watch it, and the Rogues Gallery is one of the deepest fields on which that collaboration plays out. Each villain on the wider list is a piece of shared imagination, and the wider effect of sitting with the list is to participate in the ongoing project of imagining the wider universe of the show into being. There is a final thing worth saying about the wider Rogues Gallery before we move into the closing thoughts of the night, and that is that it is a deeply hopeful catalog, even though almost every entry on it is a piece of evidence about how badly power can be used. The hope comes from the structure of the wider list itself. The list has a top and a bottom, which means it has a shape. Shapes can be understood. Understanding leads to the possibility of response. The wider show is suggesting that the project of opposing the Rogues Gallery is not hopeless. It is large. It is difficult. It is the wider task of an entire generation of meta-humans who have been, by accident of biology or technology or institutional placement, given the capacity to engage with it. But it is possible. The wider Rogues Gallery is not the end of the wider story. It is the wider middle of the story. The end, when it eventually arrives, will be the result of the slow accumulation of small choices made by the wider community of heroes against the wider community of villains, and the wider list above is a kind of partial inventory of what is currently at stake. The wider show is trusting the audience to hold all of that complexity, and the wider rogues gallery is more meaningful for being held that way. There is, finally, a small private comfort in spending this many words on a list of fictional villains, because the wider exercise of ranking them is a kind of acknowledgement that fiction matters. The wider show would not support this kind of reading if it did not deserve it, and the wider list above would not be possible to construct without the writers and the artists having put more care into the wider rogues gallery than the surface of a streaming superhero show might initially suggest. The wider experience of putting this list together is a kind of tribute to the care of the people who made the wider show, and the wider experience of listening to a list like this read aloud is a kind of tribute too. Fiction matters because the wider world is full of choices about power that are not, in the end, particularly different from the choices the wider rogues gallery is asking its characters to make. The show is comfortable with that suggestion, and the wider list above is comfortable with it too. So if you have been listening this whole way through, if you have been awake long enough to follow the wider ranking from Multipol at the bottom to the Viltrum Empire at the top, if you have been awake long enough to follow the wider thematic threads about inheritance and parenthood and unreadiness, and the slow work of opposing institutional violence, then I want to thank you for spending this much of your night with the show, and for spending this much of your night with the Rock Channel. The wider show is going to keep producing new villains. The wider list will keep getting longer. The wider universe will keep expanding in ways that the wider audience is going to keep watching, season after season, as the wider story moves towards whatever final shape its makers eventually settle on. The wider hope is that the final shape will be one that the wider audience can sit with the way they have sat with the wider rogues gallery, with patience, with curiosity, and with the willingness to hold the complexity of the wider story without flinching. Invincible has, across the seasons that have aired, become one of the more quietly serious superhero properties of the wider streaming era, and the wider rogues gallery is one of the clearest pieces of evidence about how seriously the show takes its own genre. The wider list above is not exhaustive. It is a working document, a snapshot of the wider rogues gallery as of the seasons that have aired and the comic issues that have been published. The wider list will need to be updated as the show continues, as new villains arrive, as old villains return in altered forms, as the wider Viltrumite arc moves towards whatever resolution the comic eventually settled on. The wider experience of watching the show is partly the experience of waiting for that resolution, and the wider experience of putting together a list like this one is the experience of preparing for it. There is a quiet generosity in the way the wider show has handled its rogues gallery across the seasons that have aired. The writers have not been in a hurry. They have been willing to let each villain occupy whatever screen time the wider story required, and they have been willing to defer the introduction of new villains until the wider story was ready for them. The wider effect is that the rogues gallery feels more carefully tended than the rogues galleries of most of the show's closer genre neighbors, and the wider experience of watching the show is partly the experience of trusting that the writers know what they are doing with the wider villains. The wider list above is one piece of evidence for that trust, and the seasons that remain to be made will be the larger piece. So we end where every long Invincible meditation has to end, which is at the wider question of what the show is ultimately for. The wider show is for the demonstration that the question of how to use power is the most important question a young person can sit with. The wider rogues gallery is for the demonstration of all the different ways that question can be answered badly. The wider hope is that, by sitting with the question and with the gallery for long enough, the audience can develop the kind of moral patience the wider show is trying to model. That is an unusually ambitious thing for a streaming superhero show to want to do, and Invincible has, across the seasons that have aired, been remarkably consistent in wanting it. The wider list above is one small contribution to that wider project. The wider canvas of Invincible's cultural footprint is larger than the audience the show has so far attracted, and the wider rogues gallery is the most generative piece of that footprint. There are fan communities built around the comic's individual villains. There are wider critical conversations built around the show's choices about adaptation. There are long-form essays, longer than this one, that have been written about specific villains on the wider list, and their thematic significance to the wider show. The wider experience of being an Invincible fan is partly the experience of contributing to this larger conversation, and the wider list above is one more contribution. The wider hope is that, by spending this many words sitting with the rogues gallery, the wider list has earned a small place in the wider conversation, and that the wider audience can take something from the way it has organized the gallery, even if they would have organized it differently themselves. That is where I want to leave the wider list above. It is not a final accounting, it is a snapshot. The wider show will keep producing new villains. The wider list will keep getting reshaped by new arrivals. The wider audience will keep arguing about the wider order. The wider thing that matters is that the wider show has produced a rogues gallery worth arguing about in the first place, and that the wider list above has treated that gallery with the seriousness it deserves. There is one last set of thoughts worth sitting with before the night fully closes around the wider list, and they have to do with the way Invincible has changed the conversation around what a streaming animated superhero series can be allowed to do. When the show launched in 2021, the wider streaming landscape was mostly populated by superhero properties whose moral ambitions were limited by a series of unspoken constraints. Animated superhero shows were mostly considered a younger audience product. Adult animated comedies were mostly the province of pure satire. Serious adult animated drama, with real stakes and real consequences and real moral seriousness, was a corner of the wider streaming market that almost no one was actively cultivating. Invincible has almost single-handedly changed the wider perception of what is possible in that corner. The wider success of the show has opened doors for a generation of adult animated projects that, before its arrival, would have struggled to find production resources. The wider rogues gallery is part of why this has happened. Audiences have responded to the seriousness with which Invincible treats its villains, and the wider streaming industry has taken notice. The wider implication is that the show's commitment to a morally serious rogues gallery has had consequences beyond the wider story itself. It has helped to reshape what the wider streaming animation market is willing to attempt, and the rogues gallery is one of the strongest pieces of evidence for that reshaping. There is a related point about the wider visibility of Robert Kirkman's work that earns a final acknowledgement before the night closes. Kirkman, before Invincible became the wider streaming hit it has, was mostly known for The Walking Dead, a property whose engagement with violence and moral ambiguity is well documented. The wider success of Invincible has allowed Kirkman to demonstrate that the specific kind of moral patience that made The Walking Dead distinctive is transferable to the superhero genre, and the wider rogues gallery of Invincible is one of the strongest pieces of evidence for that transfer. The villains of Invincible are recognizably constructed by the same sensibility that built The Walking Dead's wider antagonists, and the wider show is more interesting for that connection. The wider implication is that the seriousness of the wider rogues gallery is not an accident. It is the result of a deliberate authorial sensibility, applied carefully across a long career, and the wider list above is partly a tribute to that sensibility. There is one more meditation that feels right to offer before the night closes, and it has to do with the question of why a list like this one is worth assembling at all. The wider exercise of ranking fictional villains is a strange kind of project. It is not exactly criticism, it is not exactly summary, it is something closer to a kind of map-making in which the wider universe of the show is rendered as a hierarchy whose internal logic can be inspected. The wider reason a list like this is worth assembling is that the act of inspection itself is a kind of engagement with the show that the wider show rewards. Invincible has, across the seasons that have aired, produced a rogues gallery whose internal logic can be inspected at length, and the wider list above is one form of that inspection. The wider hope is that, by sitting with the list for as long as we have, the wider audience can come away with a slightly clearer sense of the shape of the wider universe, and that the slightly clearer sense will make subsequent viewings of the show more rewarding. There is a small ritual involved in finishing a long list like this one, a ritual that has to do with acknowledging the limits of the wider exercise. The wider list cannot do everything. It cannot capture the particular emotional weight of every fight scene. It cannot do justice to every supporting character. It cannot predict the wider direction the show will take in the seasons that remain. What the wider list can do is offer a snapshot, a ranking, a set of observations about the wider rogues gallery as it currently stands, and the wider audience is free to take or leave whatever pieces of the wider snapshot are useful to them. The wider list is not a final accounting, it is an offering, and the wider hope is that it has been received in the spirit in which it was given. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.